So welcome to learning how to become an excellent peer reviewer. Should we close the doors, I think, maybe? Or most of the excess noise, I think, is coming from in here. And we got to... You're going to join that group again? Okay, yeah. All right, well, welcome to SAEM. Here we are, it's the first day, or not yet the first day or something. Guys, find a place where there aren't a lot of other facilitators at. My name's Dan Mayer. I'm a retired physician. I'm a retired professor of emergency medicine. I worked at Albany Medical College long ago before I retired, and peer review has been one of my obsessions. Some people might say that it's gone a little overboard about that, but whatever. I enjoy it. I like doing it. I taught evidence-based medicine for 22 years at Albany Med, which kind of made it a perfect fit for me. And last year, 3 or 4 of our current facilitators, Adrienne, Elspeth, Mike, and there was someone else, Rob, maybe? Right. Gave a brief didactic on peer reviewing, and it occurred to me that that would make a good workshop, and I kind of got them together, and we created this thing. So we're trying it out. You guys are all our guinea pigs, and I think we're our own guinea pigs too. So I think what we're going to do is basically start by introducing everybody. Just say your name, where you're from, and whether you've had experience peer reviewing or if you're an editor or something weird like that. As I said, my name's Dan Mayer. I'm from Albany, New York. I am an associate editor at Western Journal of Emergency Medicine and at the JSEP Open. I had been an associate editor at MedEd Portal for emergency medicine. And Carly?
I'm Carly Eastin. I'm from the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. And I'm a section editor at Journal of Emergency Medicine for the abstract section, and also a peer reviewer for various journals. In
the back there, Ian, you're the furthest back. Can you hear okay?
Yes.
All right. You want to start? You can, but I was just going to make sure that we didn't need the mics.
I can hear fine.
Okay. You want to start? Go ahead.
I'm Ian McLaughlin, emergency medicine in San Francisco. I'm at Kaiser Permanente, and not a reviewer. Wanted to learn how to write better.
I'm Adrienne N. I'm a faculty member at the hospital in Kansas City. I am a peer reviewer for several journals and got into this when I was absolutely certain that I had no business doing it. So now
I'm Elizabeth Schoenfeld from UMass Bay State, and I am a qualitative method decision editor for academic emergency medicine. I also want people to be encouraged to do it because we send out a lot of requests for reviewers before we get our 3 reviewers. So I want there to be a bigger pool of people who do a good job doing peer review.
And I'm Richelle Cooper. I've been a MSHS editor at Annals of Emergency Medicine for 25 years now, and I'm executive deputy editor there. And I think we need more reviewers of varied backgrounds because if you look at who does reviews and who becomes editors, the diversity comes from the peer review.
I'm Adrienne N. I'm a research at the Affiliation Bias, and I'm looking for what peer reviewers are looking for actually.
I'm David Sklar, the former editor-in-chief for academic medicine, so mostly areas of medical education research.
I'm Carrie McCabe, also at Boston Medical Center. It's very nice to meet you. I had to come to Boston to meet you. I have reviewed one paper as part of a junior peer reviewing process, and I enjoyed it, which I hesitate to say, but I did. And I'm hoping to learn how to do it better because I'd like to get involved.
Good. Daniel?
Hi, I'm Dan Heckman. I'm a data scientist at University of Wisconsin Madison, and I've been on the receiving end of a number of peer reviews, but looking to learn more about that process.
My name is Karen. I'm at University Hospital in Cleveland.
Rich Sinert from Kings County in Brooklyn. I've been a decision editor and now a peer reviewer.
Khoujah, Tampa. I am a decision editor for Western and a peer reviewer for a lot of other journals.
Mike?
I'm Mike Gottlieb, I'm in Chicago. I'm an editor on Analysis of Emergency Medicine, Academic Medicine, AMPNT, Western, ADEM, and then I'm the social media editor for Academic Emergency Medicine.
It's a little overachiever, right, Mike? Lynn?
I'm Lynn P. I am a newly retired professor from UT Southwestern. I love saying that. I'm retired for a month, and then I'm going to work with the staff at JPS in Fort Worth. I am a senior editor for Journal of Emergency Medicine. That's the only journal I've ever edited for, and was a reviewer from many, many years ago. University was my mentor as a medical student, and so I wanted to review and work full circle. I'm still learning, but I love it. I really enjoy it, and I learn a lot of mental level and helping me a better clinician.
I'm Nick Saltarelli. I'm up at John Pearson up the road in Fort Worth. When I told my wife I was looking at peer review, she said that I was always better at critiquing other work than doing my own data science. I'm a natural research director.
I'm Will Cross, I'm a medical education fellow at the University of Michigan. I peer reviewed one paper, looking to get better at it.
I'm Mark Langdorf. I'm from the University of California, Irvine, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Western Journal of Emergency Medicine and associate editor for clinical practice and cases in emergency medicine.
I'm Casey Glass. I'm an associate professor at Pearce, and I have peer reviewed for several different journals, and I'm a section editor for the Khoujah.
My name is Liz Ehrman. I'm the faculty at Mass General, and I've reviewed a number of papers, but I've never actually been taught how to do it, so God knows what I'm doing perfectly at all. So I thought I would make sure I learn how to do it properly.
My name is Martin Wegman. I'm research fellow at Eastin and then also emergency physician at Florida Medical Center in Florida. I previously on editorial work for the Medical Quality Journal and just do kind of ad hoc peer review at this point.
I'm Elspeth Pearce. I'm at the University of Kansas, and I'm a peer reviewer. I got into it like pretty early in my career, and so the imposter syndrome is strong.
Mr. Shirazi, I'm a professor of emergency medicine and medical toxicology. I'm a first graduate from actually UT Southwest. I wanted to go far away. I've done lots of editing. I just want to find new capabilities.
I'm Robert Hunnett from Wayne State. I love stats. You can't do it.
Leo Aliaga, I'm a medical education fellow at Stanford. Minimal experience with peer reviewing, would love to learn more, and also helps with the writing process.
I'm Ryan Heidish. I'm a research coordinator at George Washington University. And to learn more about the peer review process.
Tony Paul, University of Arkansas. I've been a peer reviewer for various journals over years and prefer that than receiving the peer review of my articles. I think many of us have been there, but I think this is an important workshop. So
And Jeff Kline, I'm the editor-in-chief of Academic Emergency Medicine, also from Wayne State, and I guess I've been peer reviewer for over 20 years and still review papers for other journals.
One other person just came in. Just
I'm Judy Linden from BU, Boston Medical Center, peer reviewer for various sundry journals, but would really like to learn how to do it the correct way.
And Elspeth, you're going to take us through this. Oh, next slide. Sorry. I just hit this. Here we go. What are we supposed to do here?
Pull everywhere on a few of these slides. If you want to, the QR code should take you directly there, or if you type in the address or the text. Multiple options. If you lose it, every slide of the question should have the QR code so that you can get back to it. And hopefully this works. Fingers crossed.
So we're going to try and see if we can be a little more interactive on the lecture side than better leave that up for a little longer. Okay. Are we good? All right. So last minute photographs. And a few of us have financial conflicts of interest, which we've listed here. Give you a second to read those and decide if we're total full of it or whatever. And we all have intellectual conflicts of interest by being editors of, or associate editors of journals.
Because we want your free labor.
What are we doing?
I'm looking for the slide of answer to see if anybody hated away.
Somebody lost something.
We're hoping to record this, so it wouldn't be.
We've been told it's being recorded. So,
The previous presenter may have accidentally taken it. I'll have to go.
well, there's the forward button. It works fine.
Okay. I'll get you one. Thank you.
All right. Anything that's prehistoric, I can do great. All right, so Carly is going to start with talking about just introducing the whole concept of peer review and overview.
Okay, so this is just an overview of the workshop. And can everyone hear me, or do I need a mic?
To record it, if you speak in the mic, that'll be better.
So we're going to initially start with a little bit of lecture, just a few minutes. Then we're going to break into our groups, which we kind of naturally have done, it looks like. And then we're going to be going through kind of a 50-foot view or a 2,000-foot view of the abstract introduction. We'll look at this paper that we have, the example paper, and then we'll go into methods and results, discussion limitations, and what's the overview on how to approach those areas, and then how do we approach it in terms of this paper, this example. So that's kind of how the workshop will go, and then we'll have about an hour at the end to talk about just each group's experience in the small group discussions and kind of our perspectives on this paper and peer review in general. Okay, we kind of already talked about this, but if you could answer just so that we can record a few things so for future workshops so we know kind of who is here. And then, Elspeth, is it supposed to show the results? But we kind of went through when everybody introduced themselves of how experienced you are with peer review. So it's nice to have a broad spectrum here. We have some that have only done one or none, and some that have been doing many for many years. And so I think this will be a really good discussion with different perspectives. So what is peer review? Peer review is the critical appraisal of a manuscript. So a lot of people think that you have to be an expert or have really advanced statistical training to be a peer reviewer, and that's just not the case. What you really need to be is a critical thinker and also understand the basics of critical appraisal. So if you understand evidence-based medicine and how to approach just looking at a paper critically and how to read a paper, then you can be a peer reviewer. You don't have to be an expert necessarily in advanced methodology. You don't have to be an expert in advanced statistics. You should try to peer review in the content area you're an expert in, but even if you're not in a specific content area, if you have a good basis of evidence-based medicine, then you can be a peer reviewer as you're developing your own niche. So don't be overwhelmed or feel like you can't do it if you don't have a lot of experience. So peer review has been kind of the foundation of scientific literature for many, many several hundred years. And really the scientific knowledge and all of the knowledge translation we have could not survive without good peer review. And lately it's been very difficult to find quality peer reviewers and people that are willing to do it, partially because I think people don't think they can do it because they may not feel like they have the skills, but also time is difficult, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But people understanding how to get into peer review sometimes is a barrier as well. There are different types of peer review. Open peer review is where you can see the author's names, the authors know who reviewed them. This is not a super common type of review anymore, but some journals will do this kind of open peer review. Single blind peer review is pretty common, where you'll have, often the reviewers will be blinded, but the authors won't be blinded necessarily. That's a single blind review. A double blind review is where both parties will be blinded to each other. So as the reviewer, you won't be able to see the author's names or their institution or anything. It will be completely blinded. And then as the author, when you get your comments back, you won't know who the reviewers were. Dynamic peer review is not super common in EM, but this is something that where you might publish something on a preprint server, and then you get comments and you're editing kind of in real time after you've already published it. So it's getting real world feedback on your literature. It's not really something that is common in emergency medicine, but it is a type of peer review. And then the final type that we do see is called cascading or waterfall review. And this happens when, let's say, and some of you may have experienced this, you submit your article to a specific journal. They say, hey, here's some feedback. We don't feel your article's appropriate for our journal, but we're going to refer you to another journal. And so that's called kind of a cascading review, where they would refer you to another journal. You would still get another peer review there, usually, but that's kind of like where you're being referred from one to another journal. So the benefits of peer review, the goal is to improve the quality and the credibility of the paper. So you want to make sure that it's relevant, make sure it's high quality, make sure the methodology is good, and make sure that the results and conclusions actually reflect what's in the paper. You also want to catch errors that the authors may not have caught during their writing. The downsides of peer review, reviews can be biased, and we're going to go over a couple of types of bias. They may still miss errors, and people have studied the peer reviews in the past, and peer reviewers are not perfect, and nobody expects you to be, and so you can still miss some errors. That's why we have multiple people do peer reviews, so that you have a higher likelihood of catching multiple errors. Reviews may not be consistent because some people have different skill sets, and some people have a better or different understandings of how to perform peer review. A good review does take time, so that's a big limitation because people don't have a lot of extra time, and you're not paid for this kind of thing, and we'll get into that when Jeff talks a little bit later. And it's really hard to find reviewers. So that's a downside because maybe some of you have experienced this where it takes 4 to 6 months to get a paper back because the journal can't find reviewers, and so they're spending several months trying to find someone to review the article, and so it can take a lot of time. So you're trying to get your knowledge out there to the world, but then it can take a long time because we can't find peer reviewers. Yeah.
Since I feel like this is very honest.
Yes,
about,
please.
One benefit that you guys actually brought up is that you get better at writing papers.
Yes.
Errors, and I think a lot of people are here. And then another one, and this one conflicts a little bit with some of the stuff that we'll talk about later about sort of being unbiased, but you bring yourself to the role, and so if you think an area is important and they send you papers, you get to influence the literature. Right? And that doesn't mean that you blanket say, like I do shared decision-making research, and I say, yay, it's a shared decision-making paper, and I don't critically review it. I say, yes, you should submit it, you should accept it. But it means that if I see something that I think is really important, I can do a really good job being critical, but critical in a positive way. And I say, listen, this is really important. These are the things that they need to fix. But the more effort and work that I put into making that better, the more likely this thing that I also agree is important, then sort of moves on and gets published. So it does allow us to influence our field. If you think about like all the different things that you touch in the field and you help them move forward, if you're helping things move forward that you think that are really important, social emergency medicine, or that sort of thing, you help make those papers better, then you're influencing the future of our field and the research in the field. So I think that that's a really big way that you can help the field of emergency medicine as a peer reviewer.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and it also makes your own research better because you can look at the plans that you have for whatever project you're doing, and you can say, okay, how would a reviewer be looking at this? And you can do that actually in your planning stage, not after the paper's written. So it can help you in a lot of different ways. So, okay, so these are the main types of EM journals. You don't need to memorize this or by any means, but there are subscription-based journals, and those are typically you'll get those through your university or if you pay an annual fee. And then there are open access journals that some of those will charge an article processing fee to publish in that journal. And then there are some open access journals that I think Dr. Kline will talk about that may not have a good peer review process, and those can be considered predatory. And so we'll get into kind of what that means, how to identify those, and how to avoid those. And then there are preprint servers that basically you can just take your paper that's not even peer reviewed and publish it online on a preprint server. And it means that it has not yet been peer reviewed. Here are just a few common types of bias when you're doing peer review. A referee bias is just a bias against the author it could be for really any reason, but if you know who the author is, that can create a bias. That's why a lot of journals have gone to blinded review. Same for the ad hominem, that if you know that author's work, then you may have a bias either for or against that author. Again, why a lot of journals will do blinded review. But if you're in a very niche field, you may still be able to figure out who that is, and so there may still be a bias there. Even if the paper's blinded, you may still be able to figure out based on the specific study that they're doing. So there may still be a bias even if we're trying to avoid it. So affiliation bias, same thing. If you know where the author's institution is, you could have a bias for or against that. And then your beliefs about that particular study and the validity of that kind of objective or outcome or conclusion. And then a conflict of interest is common that we try to avoid if you have a financial interest in whatever that paper could be about. Okay, so I only have a couple more. So tips for effective peer review, and we're going to get into a lot more detail later on, but one of the biggest things is you want to be professional and courteous. This is, you are being skeptical of the paper, and you want to be critical, but you don't want to be rude or unprofessional. So there are ways to word things and phrase things that can be still professional, but still get your point across that you're concerned about this flaw or that error. There are ways to do it professionally. You want to make sure you're reading the instructions. Different journals have different specific instructions on how they want their review structured, and so it's important to actually read the instructions. You want to try to be helpful, and you want to be as specific as you can, because the editors can tell who's actually trying to be helpful and specific versus ones that say, hey, this paper's great, or this is terrible. You want to actually provide examples within that paper and be specific. You want to try to be on time as much as you can, and actually being as fast as being timely is really important. If you're going to miss a deadline, you want to let the editor know that you cannot make that deadline, or just decline the invitation altogether, because the being on time is part of what we talked about just a few minutes ago. If you're submitting your manuscript to a journal and the reviewers aren't going to be on time, then that further delays the whole process. And so they're trying to get an answer back to that author as soon as possible, and so you want to really try to be on time. And then check your biases that we just discussed. So in talking with several of us, the general approach, especially if you're kind of a novice reviewer, is you want to read the journal guidelines. What is the journal, what's their kind of overarching goal, and who are their readers? What kinds of articles are they trying to publish? You want to become familiar with the manuscript. So what I will do, and some other people have talked about this, you want to read the whole article, and then you want to put it away. And then maybe you get it back out a few hours later or the next day, because then you've have a good concept of what the paper is about, and then you can go through and actually do a detailed review. It's good to just have read it once so that you have a good understanding of the overall objective and methods and results before you actually get into the critical review. You want to understand the reporting guidelines. So the Equator Network has a list of each type of study, so you want to know what type of study are you reviewing. If you don't know the reporting guidelines for that type of study, randomized controlled trial or a cohort study or a case series or whatever it is, you can go on the Equator Network and download the reporting guidelines for that kind of study and just make sure that the paper is following those. Another thing that I like to do is have my critical appraisal form that I use in Journal Club and for teaching residents. I have that also next to my reporting guidelines so that I know what main points of bias am I trying to identify. Then you want to look for major flaws and minor flaws. And that's how a lot of journals want you to structure the review, is kind of identifying what are the big major things that either sink the paper or that can maybe be fixed if they address these problems, or and then what are the minor things that are more like maybe something's labeled wrong, or maybe there's some other minor thing that can be fixed. But the major flaws are things like methods problems, interpretation problems, organization of the manuscript, that kind of thing. Any? Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think this is good, but for me as an editor-in-chief, what I was really looking for from the reviewers was, and particularly if they were there for content, is this something that's important? In other words, is the message here an important message? Is there something new here? And usually, again, particularly if you're someone who has done work in that particular field, you can say something about that. Now, if you haven't, you're basically looking at something you're not so familiar with, then maybe, again, these flaws may be a good way to look at it. But if you can say, yeah, this is really an important message here, and there's a lot of new things that the person's coming up with, then at least for me, trying to make a decision about a manuscript, I found that very helpful.
I'm not going to be the old guy that goes over 5-minute timer.
Sorry.
All right, so let me ask some of the folks that are relatively young here. SAM publishes academic emergency medicine, education and training, and the publisher is Wiley. So who pays who? Does SAM pay Wiley, or does Wiley pay SAM? Anybody know? Or is there no transactional? Is there any money exchanged? Who makes money? Yeah, so the publisher makes money, but the publisher does pay a certain stipend to SAM to be able to publish the journal, and they make money off of what? Subscriptions and advertisement. And you've seen the stuff in the news, if you like Glockenflecken, about how he's been making fun of these publishers for making us pay to publish our work. And so that's the for pay model. And so lots of really good open source journals, you got to pay thousands of dollars to publish them. And we were just talking this morning that it's Nature Neurology, or in one of the Natures, costs like $11,000 to publish a paper in. That's like more than the raise you get to go from associate to professor, so why do this? And then the predatory journals is a misnomer. They're the P.T. Barnums. They're out there looking for the suckers that are willing to pay for really what's a fake journal. And they'll give a fake impact factor too. They'll say IF 4.1, but they're not talking about the Clarivate impact factor. They just made a number up, or they paid somebody to claim they have it. So those are out there, and those are issues. But when it comes to governance, there can be some reciprocity where you'll have boards of directors that are interested in money and they're interested in sort of the oversight of their specialty. And sometimes boards meddle. I mean, they come in, MEDDLE, they'll come in and say things like, you've got to put a table that covers DEI in every article. And you're like, what if it's a reflection piece? Can, we put that in there? So sometimes there'll be boards that are meaning well that will come in, and you as a peer reviewer might not understand exactly why something is in there, but it sort of comes from the top down. So every now and then, there's things that you don't quite understand. There's one, I was on a clinical practice guidelines with the American Society of Hematology. The whole time we're on it, we've got to deal with blood, great journal, impact factor 19. I was like, yeah, I'm finally going to get my name on a blood paper. And so they submit it to blood, and the blood editors-in-chief say, we're not publishing it. We don't want it. Send it to the online journal that they have called Blood Advances. And so they even got the board involved, and the board got in a scrum with the editor-in-chief of Blood, and the editor-in-chief won and didn't publish it. So sometimes there's political stuff that's happening, between sort of the publishing entity and the editors-in-chief at the background. So, it might sort of creep down. You might sort of wonder why some decisions were made, but sometimes it has to do with that governance. Let me briefly touch on the sort of political issue of plagiarism and data splitting. And from here on out, the theme of what I'm going to say is there's really no good rule-based way of deciding the next couple things I'm going to talk about. Because as ER doctors, we like to follow rules. If somebody's wheezing, we give them albuterol and steroids because that's pretty much a rule-driven thing to do. And you want a set of rules to define something like plagiarism, but there is none. You can go to the ICJME, the International Council of Journal Medical Editors. You'll find something that basically says plagiarism is stealing too much work, and that's about it. Publishers really don't have criteria for it. It is in the eye of the beholder. And what if an author copies 3 or 4 paragraphs from their methods paper that's already published and then uses it exactly verbatim in a new paper, but has all new data? Well, that's technically plagiarism, but what does that mean, plagiarism? There's not some panel of folks with black hoods somewhere in The Hague that then take their scepter and say, plagiarism has happened. It doesn't work like that. It is up to the reviewers to inform the editors, hey, this really, really looks like this other paper. And I'm going to tell you a story. I had one where I had a paper that looked exactly like another paper that was published in a neurology journal. And I ran it all the way up the chain. So this is basically where the buck stopped with plagiarism with me as editor-in-chief. The way that I would have had to put teeth behind it. Now get this for a minute. This is why I have D&I insurance. Is I would have had to go to these doctors' dean of the med school and say, I am accusing them of plagiarism. Well, why am I going to do? I'm not a cop. I'm an editor-in-chief. And imagine that, they could sue me for whatever, defamation, something like that. So plagiarism is a fungible thing to me. And Dave, I'd love to hear anything more you have to say about that. Same rules with data splitting.
Okay, a lot of programs and editors, there is plagiarism software, so it gets run.
Yeah.
I've run it before there, and so it was.
You put the red flag up.
But self-plagiarism, sort of like, it's your paper, your methods. Why should you rewrite that? It's like, if you wrote a really good paper that's clear, trying to change the words so it's less clear. It's sort of like the reasoning behind what someone's copying and not copying. Sorry, I made you go over.
It's all your fault, Richelle. All right, just 1 minute. All right, I promise, just 1 minute. And the same goes with data splitting. And I'll just put it to you as the peer reviewer. If you're uncomfortable with it and it kind of makes you a little queasy, let your decision editor know, because that's sort of the start of having a conversation with the authors about this isn't a good look for you. You don't look good in peer review when you've copied yourself so much. So I just wanted to say there's no explicit rules. Last thing I just want to touch on is AI. Everybody wants to barf when they hear chat GPT, right? So is it ethical? Is it not? I'm just going to tell you that, again, there's no definite rule. I, as editor-in-chief, want to promote it because I believe Writer and ChatGPT Plus, the one you got to pay for that doesn't hallucinate and doesn't make stuff up, could help individuals with disabilities, especially those with severe, just writing disabilities in general, and also those that aren't very good at speaking English. So I could see it as closing a certain degree of a disparity. So I kind of come down on the side of not harshing so bad. I don't want the paper completely written by writer or AI. I just want to know if you asked for it. And we ask now at AEM whether or not you used one. I started at about, when Mike, we started this paper about 2 months ago. And so in response to an editorial that Mike Gottlieb wrote, that's at AGEM, right? It's in press. We started asking this question. I think I've had 4 people admit that they used ChatGPT. And we don't not review you or anything. We just ask whether or not you used Writer or ChatGPT. And so I'll just say the things that I've just talked about, there's no definite rules. So if you're a peer reviewer, you're not going to find some hard set laws about how some of these things work. We just want your opinion. And your opinion is really sets the law. All right, so.
All right, so I guess that's me.
Over to you, Dan. And you can advance.
Yeah. Did I do the wrong button? No. All right. Is this thing working, Elspeth?
For some reason, it's not showing results.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's not.
Is there maybe oh, there, it showed a result. All right, so it sounds like everybody agrees, but did everybody vote? Or just the one person who voted? Oh, there we got a bunch more. Okay, that's interesting. We got to wait till everybody votes before. I'm going to call it now. All right. So, I mean, it looks like most people agreed with me, A and B only. I don't know. I get a lot of respect for being a reviewer. I feel like it. That the editors I've reviewed for have been incredibly generous with their praise for what I've done and understanding when I have a problem and get things wrong. David, when he was the editor at Academic Medicine, I hope I'm not telling tales out of school, but he would always send me the hardest studies to review, which I took as a badge of courage. So, so I definitely got plenty of respect there. But I never got time off for it, and I think that's a big deal. All right, so now we're in our small groups. We're going to kind of stick with these tables, but some people signed up before Friday, and I sent them all papers. So just show me your hands if you have got a paper ahead of time. Keep them up so I can kind of. So we have at least one person at each table, except this table, who got the papers ahead of time. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about each section of the paper. And it's a lot to sit there and read a paper while you're having a discussion. So the people who have read it, I'm going to ask you to kind of let your cohorts, your colleagues at the table know what was said and what your take is, and point them to various parts so we can have a brief discussion on your tables about what's going on in that part of the paper. There are extra copies in the middle. I think the most important thing about the paper is I want to thank Jeff Kline for being willing to let us review it. It's a paper that he had something to do with. And I think this will be really helpful. While you're all just getting ready, let's take let's see. So we've been going for almost an hour. Let's take like a 10-minute stretch break, and we'll come back to these groups, and then we'll talk about first each section of the paper. So we've got the initial intro and abstract, then the methods and results, and then the discussion, limitations, and conclusions. So a brief break, and then we'll start this whole process. Okay?
All right, so sorry, we're going to interrupt the groups who have already started reviewing this paper. All right. Yeah. So, yeah, sorry to interrupt all the conversations that are already happening. Mike, can you guys hear me? Okay, there we go. All right, so sorry to interrupt. we're going to kind of keep going. So just kind of a quick question before we get started. What do you guys think the most read components of the paper are? And hopefully yeah, the tweetorial, the blog post. Read in general by the general populace of people who read journals. Yeah. So yeah, highlighting the importance of the abstract.
And we want honesty here.
Yeah.
What you think.
Maybe the only question should be
Yeah.
the only part.
Yeah, the only part. Yeah, there.
The only part.
All right. So kind of tackling this section of like the big picture, the intro, and the abstract. For me, I'm fairly new to peer review, so I was like, oh, this is like the easy part. But then thinking about it, it's like, this is actually one of the more important parts, if not the most important, especially the abstract, because it is typically what is read out of the paper if anybody's going to read any component of it. So thinking about kind of big picture stuff, which was sort of addressed in our overview, before you're going to accept a review, always think about, do you have the expertise and do you have the time? And as was mentioned, like the expertise might not be like, I am the foremost expert in this, this topic specifically, but just do I have the background knowledge that I can provide a good review? It's not all brand new information to me. And then also, do I have the time to do this? So if I'm looking at a new review and it says this is going to be like a 60-page paper to review, and I have, 16 clinical shifts in that like 2-week period or something, I'm not going to be able to take that review, but I might be able to fit in, a case report or something fairly quick. So, making sure that you have the time, you can get it in. They typically tell you when there's a due date for you. And then how much time should you set aside? So I'm a new reviewer, I set aside more time than probably our expert reviewers don't have to set aside quite as much time. So for me, typically 6 hours, if not a little bit more for longer stuff or more complex studies, and typically spaced out over a few days. And that's kind of my approach. I'm sure other people have different approaches, but that helps me read the paper a few times, think about it in between, come up with new questions to readdress with the paper, and get my review all nice and typed up, which sometimes takes a lot longer than I expect, to be submitted by the deadline. And then kind of that first read of the paper, can you identify a research question? Like, what is the purpose of this paper? Is really kind of like get that forest view, and what are what is the author trying to address? What maybe is the big problem? What's the big research question? And then do they frame the whole paper from that?
And if I could just put a little bit of a plug in too, for that first piece. If you know you don't have time for it, just hit no right away. The tendency is we're like, I don't have time for it. I just snooze it. I'll come back to email later. But most editorial software will sit at between maybe 3 and 12 days is roughly the average, and most use about 5 to 7 days. So that entire time, that means another reviewer can't be invited. So if you know you're going to say no, say it early so that it just automates the next process. Because on the other end of it, right, when you've gotten those reviews and you're like, my paper's in review for like 4-6 months, most of the reason for that is because it's going through sequential people that are taking 5 to 12 days to say no, or it just times out in the system. And so it ends up helping out the person on the back end who submitted their paper to get it done quicker if you just say no right away. That's totally fine to say no. It's actually much more preferred to say no right away so that we can kind of move on to next reviewers. And then you don't get follow-up emails.
The big picture research question that frames everything, the other question I ask myself is like, even if it was done perfectly, would I say so what at the end of the day? Because if it doesn't matter, not the right question to ask, then you sort of like, that should frame how you think about, is there some kernel in there? Is this important? Why is this important? That one you should ask yourself before you agree to do it. Because if you don't care about
And many journals will send, when they invite you to be a peer reviewer, they'll send you the abstracts. So you do have that option to make that decision for yourself and say, does this pass the so what test? And is it something that I can really get behind, or is this something that, boy, this is a little out of my wheelhouse, I could probably figure it out, but maybe it'd be better for me to use my time in a little more productive way.
Flip side about the so what question, there are editors in the room whose journals have a 5% acceptance rate and editors in the room whose journals have a higher acceptance rate. The so what question doesn't always matter, and hasn't been done before also doesn't always matter. For some journals, it's been done before, it's just fine to do another good paper on it. And also, if it's only matters somewhat, that's not necessarily a definite no.
Science only works well if we replicate results, replicable results. That's what we should be looking at.
And so it means different things to different people in different journals. You might submit something to Annals and they say no, and because it's not, maybe they've recently published something, but another journal might have an interest in that particular area, or it might just be something that is not within sort of the scope. EMs become so big, right? That, some journals publish certain types of articles and not others, and so again, don't be discouraged. I guess that's more for when you're submitting papers, yeah.
I just wanted to mention just something related to declining to review, which is completely fine. I think, like we were talking about, there's a lot of respect for our time. But if you sign up to be a reviewer for a journal and you never accept, you kind of get notice that you're like, this person never accepts that they're one of our reviewers. So just keep that in mind. Just if you're going to sign up, just agree to do it one occasionally when you have time.
Yeah, and when you sign up, you can specify what topics you want to be sent papers. So instead of getting a random thing that doesn't meet any of your criteria for expertise, you will get a better selection of papers. Other big picture things, overall formatting, does this meet the formatting of the journal? Did they take the time? Are there proper citations? Is anything like glaringly missing? And then, kind of looking through, does this feel like there's an agenda behind it? If so, kind of definitely double check, make sure that you're looking for bias. And then, is there anything that seems to be misrepresented? So does the abstract represent the paper? Does the title represent the paper? You don't want a negative outcome to be supported by a positively sounding title. It's okay to publish negative papers, right? You just have to present them in a way that makes sense. And then, this is kind of the look for, any red flags, any giant errors, anything that, maybe you want to communicate with the editors about before settling into a review. And spending your time on something that might need, a little bit of editorial help. Anything else?
I would just maybe caution a separation of the science from the writing. We read papers that are written very poorly, whether it be because there's language barriers, there's less experience with it. But if the science is good, step back from the writing, because you can always get feedback and say, your introduction should be framed this way. Here's key literature missing. Your discussion has a lot of skew, and shifting it into what's a negative study. Be okay with a negative study. That's okay, right? But try to separate that from the science, right? So that's why I'm a big proponent of look at the study itself, and then see how that introduction discussion kind of aligns with what you think it should from your lens, from your experience. But if the writing isn't great, but the study is good, be okay separating those out, and it wouldn't kill the study. It just means that maybe they need some help adjusting the framing.
So addressing the abstract, this is going to be probably the highest read component of the paper, and typically what people will look at if they don't have access, paid for subscriptions and things like that. So this will be read the most, and it should be a short summary of the main components of the paper. So just kind of double check, make sure that they're representing things accurately from the abstract to the main paper, and then just kind of double check that they're not overreaching, they're not trying to present more, than they did in the body of the paper. And it should only contain information that's covered in the paper. So just make sure that things in the abstract aren't just kind of there floating nebulously on their own, and not supported by the rest of the paper. So, kind of, again, if you only read the abstract, do you understand the paper? is kind of the big thing from just looking at the abstract. And so this should probably be reviewed a couple of times just to make sure between the body of the paper and the abstract, everything is matching up. And then kind of quickly through our introduction components. So it should be addressing previous studies that are relevant. It should probably identify the gap that the rest of the paper is going to address, and the relevance to the audience. And this is going to be dependent on what journal you're reviewing for. And so, even if it's something that seems like a super subspecialty thing, if it works for a general EM audience, then that's a great topic for a general EM journal. But if it's something that seems like only people who do ultrasound in pediatrics would ever be interested in, then that maybe needs to be in a more specialized journal. And then kind of identifying the scope of the problem, who is this relevant to, what the population is going to be. And you shouldn't have like all of the methods and all of the discussion packed into the intro. So make sure the intro only is really going over the background components and the history. This is going to be where most of the citations are located. So double checking, making sure that they're using a good body of evidence, they're citing appropriate papers. And then also, if there seem to be missing citations, is this common knowledge, or is this something that should have a citation associated with it? And don't go looking for the citation to tell them which paper they should cite necessarily, unless you know it off the top of your head. You can just say like, this sounds like something that needs a citation. This claim sounds like something that needs a citation. So and then at the end, can you answer these questions? So how original is this research? Is this novel to the field? Is this supporting other evidence? Kind of where does this fit in the total body? And then kind of what does it address the gap that it is presented? And does it stick to kind of the research question?
So I'm a big fan of the problem gap framework compared to Moral and Langdorf. It's a model for introductions. But in big picture terms, intro when you're looking at it should frame what's the big overarching problem, right? It doesn't need to be overall, it doesn't need to be so broad that it's just vague, right? Chest pain is common. Heart attacks are bad. That's a little bit too big, right? But it should situate more of a global problem of, okay, this study is now sitting in the context of a bigger realm of literature. And then it's to funnel down a little bit and say, okay, here's the area that literature is focusing on. Then what's the gap? And a big red flag whenever you're reading a paper is that they say this is the first study to ever do this. Mike. Sorry. So a big red flag is if it says something along the lines of, this is the first study to ever do this, nothing is ever the first study to do anything. There's always existing literature. You should be able to say, all right, here's the existing literature and here's the gap I am addressing, because also no study covers everything. There is uniqueness in what you've done that's different from the priors. But if they go from problem, they immediately say, here's what we're doing, and they don't say, here's what's been done before that we are now filling in that gap for it, I worry their literature search is inadequate, because there's always something that informs it. So I'll say, okay, what's the gap? How important is this gap, right? Did they do something that's a minuscule change or a bigger change? And then what's the hook? What are they going to kind of draw it home with? And so it's one of the things I keep in mind with this. As for citations, there's a balance. I don't need 7,000 citations in my intro. That doesn't really help anyone. If you have too many citations, people aren't going to look at them. And that's just a list. And it looks bulky. You're like, oh, look how many citations they have, but no one's going to use that. If you have too few, well, you're going to miss the key literature. So it needs to be a balance. You don't need to cite every paper that's ever been done. If you're doing a study on PE, you don't need to cite every study that's ever mentioned the word PE. Pick the ones that are relevant to your question, the most pertinent studies. And I'll flag I'll put that as a reviewer editor, say, this could benefit from additional citations. And if I know those examples, I'll include them. I usually try to help guide them if I know it. And if I don't, I say, this is where the gap is there, right? The same thing as if there's 40 citations, I might ask them to trim it down a little bit to the ones that they want the readers to look at. Because that's the purpose. It's not the numbers. We want them to look at the ones who are most relevant in there. And so as I'm looking at the intro, that's usually why I'm framing that as, what's the problem? What's the gap? How is it compared to prior literature? What's the hook? And are the citations robust but not so lengthy that no one will actually look at them?
All right, so just like a quick highlight of common mistakes. So formatting for the journal that you are reviewing for, some papers will be sent de novo from another journal rejection, and so if they're not formatted correctly, that could be a big red flag, maybe not necessarily a total rejection, but just something to look at. And then changing the title to make something sound better than it is, or changing the abstract. And then, make sure that you got the whole paper when, as a reviewer. Sometimes things might be missing, so they'll mention like an appendix that's not included, or some graphs or charts that weren't included. Just make sure you have everything. Talk to the editor if you're missing things. And this is what I didn't realize as a reviewer when I was starting out. You can talk to the editors. Reach out for them for help if you need it. And then, if the intro does not present a clear research problem, a clear research question, look for that. And then, kind of outdated, not complete background literature. And is it too long or too short? So is the intro like 2 sentences, or is the intro the entire length of the paper and they did like 2 sentences in methods and a very short discussion? So just kind of making sure that the length matches up.
Quick comment?
Yeah.
Formatting, for what it's worth, our journal will take the format of another journal's decline. So it'll save you 2 hours. Other publishing companies may adhere to their specific format, but you don't have to.
And I don't think, like, I don't expect the peer reviewer to tell someone to put it into anal style. I'm a MEHP editor. As a MEHP editor, I'm going to make sure it has that if I decide to go for revision. So if someone, and there's no reason for me to tell someone to do that if I'm not taking the paper. So there are some journals that, but it's sort of like, in this day and age, most papers you're going to shop around. If you had to reformat it for every journal chart, the content should be there, right? Do you know what's sort of going on? And every journal is going to want the content, just maybe a different level of detail.
Yeah.
Published, where someone tried to quantify the time and money. They tried to quantify the time and money of spent reformatting for different journal styles, and it was something astounding. Like, I don't remember, was it like 1.2 billion, or it was insane. It was just the amount of. So I don't know. I would agree. I think it's my approach is it's not the peer reviewer's job to make sure it's formatted and spell checked and this and that. Sometimes that makes it hard to read, and that plays into it. But like Mike said, if it's you should judge the science, not how it looks or how it reads.
Yeah, that process is kind of painful. I went through one with, I submitted an article to The Lancet. It went through 3 rounds of revisions with the editorial staff, and then the desk rejected it. And I was like, really? Like, you could have desk rejected it way before I spent hours and hours on these micro revisions of weird font size stuff. But that said, I mean, it's a huge waste of time in terms of things if you're not going to end up liking the paper. But there's a balance. So I will usually fix the abstract so it's reasonably aligned with theirs. And I'll do the things that are like fairly quick fixes. Like, I'll go in my reference manager and they'll just switch it to their journal. But I'm not going to spend forever doing those micro changes. I also, personally, I don't feel so strongly about hitting the word count exactly in that realm if I'm going to submit to a journal. If I'm jumping between 4,000 and 3,000, it's 3,500 words. I am generally, my personal take is I'm okay with it going into that journal because they are going to cut and edit things and I can bring it down later. But I don't want to spend forever bringing it down to 3,000 only for them to say, yeah, we're not interested, and have to go back up. So I usually don't spend a ton of time on that within reason. If it's 7,000 words, then you're all way off. But if it's like within a couple hundred words of the cut, I will not spend time on that because I want to see what they're going to say, because they may actually say, hey, we need a whole bunch more information, and I have a whole nother change of cuts. So it's kind of a balance of that. Just make sure you change the title page. It is a little awkward when you send it, like the cover letter, Dear JAMA, and it's not JAMA. So that's a quick, easy fix.
All right, we good?
These reviewers are trying to help you get published, and we're all in the same team here. And as you heard, a lot of us, or not me, but a lot of people here review for multiple journals. So look at their comments instead of ignoring them and submitting to another journal, because they might be reviewing your paper again, and so they might take offense to that. But I usually find it helpful.
So let's take about 15 minutes now. Work with your little small group to talk about this paper's introduction and abstract. And then we'll convene together as a group and just have a kind of a free-flowing discussion about what you saw as the positives and the negatives, positives and negatives of the paper. Abstract and intro, right. All right, I think we could, let's get together now as a big group. And which table wants to just give this summary of their conversations as sort of a lead for discussion? I'll give everyone a chance through the day, but who wants to start?
Oh, great, wonderful, great. So we were mostly.
You got to really. It's kind of directional. Okay. You have to hold it pretty close.
Can you hear me? Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So we were mostly discussing the introduction at our table. Yeah, we had started our conversation, or we had started on the abstract, but we focused on the introduction for a bit. A few kind of, I think highlighting a little bit of Mike's points, in terms of how it's structured. We really didn't have a good sense of what was, it kind of seemed to be a winding path, and then the end was not consistent with the hypothesis, the research question that was being posed. So we found that very confusing, and we're trying to figure out a good way to say that to the authors. I think the other piece that kind of we were emphasizing is sometimes when you encounter these really convoluted introductions, it's best to just kind of move on to what's the research question, see if kind of the methodology and if there's anything salvageable before you start getting into like how to help them restructure an introduction. So really, the introduction is, it leaves a lot for consideration. Yeah.
What did some of the other tables think? Who wants my mic?
So our table talked a little bit about the abstract and how there was really no clear hypothesis in the abstract. We also felt that maybe they didn't prioritize the information in the abstract properly, maybe some more information about the sample population and some of the actually proportions of the outcomes that they were measuring. Would be nice to know what the breakdown was in the population, just a little bit of information on that. So there was extra information in the abstract that maybe not necessary, and some things that were missing that we felt would be helpful.
Anybody else want to add anything?
Some of the things we talked about and sort of like what I look at as sort of editor, this is the chance for the sell. So for you as an author and for you if you're a reviewer, if you think the paper's important, helping the authors to sell it. And then sort of framing things, as with the abstract, the paper ends without a clear research question, which makes it very difficult. And so that frames everything. For me as a MEHPE editor, I ask what the question is because then I know what the study design should be. I should be able to predict what your analysis is going to be based on what you say is your question. And there should be no analysis that is not tied to an a priori stated, this is my question and what I'm asking. And so you should think about that when you're sort of doing that, because that sort of frames the whole paper and everyone's going to follow. It's a journey, right? That they're going to tell you about their story and what they did. And you want to follow it along and sort of help them to sort of communicate that.
So just a couple of things to add, so the objective of evaluating the SpO2 has different diagnostic accuracy, which didn't kind of make sense because they weren't really diagnosing. The design retrospective case control study was not even mentioned in the whole body of the paper and didn't seem like a case control study to us. This whole framework of the abstract, we're kind of talking about what journal this could have been submitted to, which I think we were mentioning JAMA has this format, but under exposure, just the definition of exposure, the whole thing didn't make sense. And then when they talked about the results, didn't meet the so what test for us with these small percentages.
And even the title is not sufficiently descriptive. Diagnostic and prognostic performance is vague. What's your dependent variable? In this case, it's death and intubation. So something like effect of emergency department entry and worst oxygen saturation on the decision for intubation and death in COVID patients across races, or something more specific than that. That wasn't, well, but this is too vague, and it doesn't hook you and tell you what the research question is in the title.
So informal poll. How many of you think that as a peer reviewer, you might have been able to give the authors a good idea of how to have restructured this introduction? Just show of hands. This separates the optimist from the pessimist, maybe. I'm not sure.
One of the things we were talking about in terms of the formats of different journals is that Annals tells you in their template that you should have essentially 3 paragraphs in your intro, and the first paragraph should be background, and the second paragraph should be goals of the investigation. No, I'm sorry, the second paragraph, yes, is more importance, and then the third paragraph is goals of the investigation. And so it makes it really, really easy as a reviewer to know what you're looking for. And frankly, any paper that you do, if you simply follow that 1, 2, 3 paragraph thing, then the reviewer can find what they're looking for. So you could say, thank you for this intro. I'm not sure I totally followed. If you put it into this format, it might be easier to follow, and then that would help their paper.
It's not clear to me that they had a clear research question. I'm loud enough. Oh, you're recording. Yeah, it's not clear that the research question is really clear, and I think that would make it really hard for me to then give them any type of feedback.
So not to put you on the spot or anything, but can you phrase a research question that might be acceptable?
I know it has something. Yeah, and no, I actually can't. It would be something to do with oxygen saturation and prognostic indicators of intubation, early intubation. But yeah,
It's hard because they don't seem to know what they actually are trying to do.
Exactly.
As a reviewer, this is really difficult.
Right.
Because you see that they spend a lot of time and this and that, but I think, I don't remember who said it, but right, the introduction is convincing you that it's an important paper. Here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and this is why my study is important. And if they can't convince you very clearly and succinctly, then there's always the possibility that maybe they don't actually know, and that's a problem. When you read really well done papers, even if they are methodologically very complex and analytically complex, great authors will be able to condense that down in a way that you might not understand the nuts and bolts of, a step wedge design or some, advanced statistical modeling technique, but you can read the intro and you can understand, you're like, oh, I kind of get the idea of the question they were trying to answer, and they use these fancy methods and statistics to test that question or to test that hypothesis, and then you can see the results. And this is, unfortunately, not one of those papers, and I think it's okay when you're reviewing a paper, if you don't understand, it's something like this, you can say it, and you always have to be civil and respectful and courteous, and you should try to, help teach the author something that sounds too maternalistic. But it is okay to say, there's some great details in here, I had a hard time following it, which, makes it, lessens the impact or whatever, something like that. But it's okay to say that in a nice way.
And then I'd say the one thing that really came up that we talked about that I think probably all the tables sort of struggled with but didn't really come out in the discussion is sort of the introduction seems to suggest a different paper than what was presented, right? They're talking about sort of what I thought was going to be different skin color affects sort of how pulse ox reads, which is sort of, in a short sense, the issues became conflated with ethnicity, and then also there was sort of, and these are real issues, right? They're real issues that people were not recognized that they were hypoxemic, they didn't get treatment, they didn't get accelerated care, but then there were also there's the structural biases that care was different in different places and for different people. And both of those are issues when we think about sort of COVID and what was sort of going on. And as we start talking about disparities a lot, and you'll see a lot of papers that talk about disparities, and sort of, you really want to push people too and push authors to be, what do you mean by, don't just tell me there's a disparity. Is this actually, you're suggesting that there's some structural reason? We should be calling it out and calling each other out, and actually what it is, as opposed to just saying there's a disparity and I've measured a difference. right? Because not every difference is an inequity. But this paper sort of suggested, at least when we all read it, and when I looked at it, I thought, they're going to tell me how this pulse ox matches an arterial gas, and that's not actually anything of what was measured in terms of diagnostic performance.
At what point is a paper not salvageable? Like, at what,
Yeah.
right? Like, you could spend 6 hours reviewing abstract and intro, like to your point, and not even get to the rest of it. So at what point do you like call time of death on a paper? And say, like, that's why you read the whole thing first.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like, is that?
I think the point that I was making as well as what you said is, you go to the research question, you try to figure out what the research question is, and I kind of feel like there's some sense of that with that hypothesis statement at the end of the introduction. So they want to look at like heterogeneity effect or moderation of race on the predictive ability of SpO2 on these 3 outcomes, right? And that's basically what they're trying to do. So try to figure out that real quick, then go to your methods, see if their methods are in alignment with that. And if they're not, if there's nothing there, then it's dead, you know what I mean? And then you don't have to do much more. You don't have to figure out if the conclusions are correct and if the introduction can be reworked and things like that. If they don't have methods to answer the research question, then there's nothing really there beyond that.
All right, I think that was a good summary. And on that note, yes, you want to add one more thing? Are we good to take a short break? Yeah, they will. Right. We have lots more time. Let's take like a 10-minute stretch break. And what time is it right now? 2:30, 2:40. We'll be back and start over again. Okay, everyone, let's get back together.
Use this to slide. There's no slide.
No, there's no. They
Okay,
can't
no
find
worries.
the clicker, so
Okay.
we have to use the
No clicker. Okay.
The moving button.
Okay.
You want me to
No, I got it.
do it for you?
No, I'm good. Okay. Yeah, you're good. Okay, so first thing we start talking about is sort of, we get all It's not on? My residents would be shocked that I can't command them because usually I clean the room. Can you hear me now? It's not on. Can you hear me now? My Verizon commercial. So we were just talking, we all get very excited about this and there's all sorts of things to learn, but we're gonna try and get sort of those of you who are learners to speak first and also to ask questions. Really, this is your time to really sort of learn. So I was told to talk about methods and bias in 5 minutes, and so I was like, oh great, that's sort of no big deal. So we're just gonna give sort of a big picture sort of overview, but it's obviously, for me, it's the most important part of the paper. And so if I'm not the editor, as editor, I read everything. But when when I pull articles, it's pretty much I read methods and results. I don't read any other part. I don't read the discussion. I don't really care what the author sort of says, how people sort of spin it. And it's when I'm sort of editor, it's the only thing that can sort of, the fatal flaws, if it's there, then I sort of move on. My also disclaimer is my slides would be fatally flawed. There's just a lot of words on there. They would not be what I would sort of use, but you'll have the sort of content. So your 2 main goals of the message review is reporting clarity. So think reproducibility. Can this study be replicated? So think journalism 101, the who, what, where, when, why, how of the study. And if you think of that organization, that will help you to figure out, do I know what they did? Where are the likely biases? And then your second goal is to find what the biases are, the threats to the validity, and is there a fatal flaw? What are the correctable flaws? You do not need to be a statistician. Most of the people who are reviewers are not. You are being asked to review as a content expert. But the methods are important. So who they selected, how they selected it. You don't need to know, is a hierarchical model a better approach to doing a regression? But you should know, this is my content area, and they didn't have those key predictor variables. What's the most important thing in that model? And so if they don't have that, then it sort of is going to be a problem. So I organize things by type of study design. It's just I sort of said when I look at the last paragraph of the introduction, what's the question? That sets everything up. And that sets up the sort of the study design. So you've already heard this before. So Equator will give you sort of what you should look for. So consort for RCTs, right? Strobe for observational studies. STAR-D, diagnostic. Prisma, okay. COREC, Qual. There you go. Squire, quality improvement. Tripod, sort of prognostic for prognosing for diagnosis. STAR-I, for the newer people. So implementation science papers. And trend, which now I can't remember what trend is because that's one obviously we don't use that much in EM. And I always, if I am MESSTATS reviewer and sort of as editor, if I'm looking at RCT, I always check the trial registration and make sure that the outcomes and what people say they're going to do is what they actually did and that they haven't changed things. And same thing, systematic review, I check Prospero and I ask authors to sort of note if they've sort of done that. And then when you're thinking about all of these studies, when you look at sort of the study design checklist, it's going to let you know where the likely biases are. And then there are some specific things. So for chart review methods, Khoujah's paper outlines most of what you should do. Clinical decision instruments and survey design. There's a couple papers that will help you to think about what is important in looking at sort of a survey. There's also a pretty good paper on sort of a couple papers on diagnostic research that I didn't include here because we ran out of room on the space. But as you start to develop a framework of reading papers and thinking about things, the more that you can have sort of a framework of what type of design it is, you're going to think about what are the most likely threats to the validity of that study. And that's just a picture of Equator. And you can sort of, there are hundreds of reporting guidelines, some very well established, some less established. But if you are looking to get started, and I sometimes send people here, Arrive is sort of for animal studies. There's one for sort of case reports. Economic evaluations are kind of their own beast that really takes sort of some pretty important expertise. But you, as a reviewer, could talk about sort of what the model is and what they sort of included. So, so then I go through as journalism 101 and I come back. So this is how I think about it. The study design. So is the design appropriate for the question they asked? So if they want to ask something about causation, most observational studies are not going to be able to do that, although I might think about sort of, have they propensity matched? Do they have information? What are they inferring? Enrolled subjects. So did they study the right population or the right database to answer the question? And then since we cannot enroll everyone, there's always going to be some sort of selection bias. And is it something that's really going to threaten what we think about or what we sort of read in sort of the paper? And we can talk about that in some of the article we're reading today. Data collection. Is it reliable? Is it complete? Were there any blinding that was needed in terms of outcome assessment? And what was the outcome measure? So is it a surrogate measure? Or have they actually asked something that would be patient-centered and clinically important? And is it a measure that is reproducible across sites? And then do they have a statistical plan? And again, for most journals, you're not expected to know this. So people who do have this expertise, it's great. And we will look across sort of things. We have a pretty specific style at Annals, so sometimes a reviewer will ask for some other analysis or say something that is not going to be in our style, and I'll sort of remove that. But it should not be your barrier to reviewing a paper. You are there as the content expert, and you can actually say, and should say, disclose to the editor. I'm not competent to sort of comment on this part of the model or this analysis or the statistic, but this is sort of what I see as the main issues. And for papers that are important, so journals will have different levels of who goes out for review. So most of the journals, so if it's original research, any research paper at Annals gets a MESSTATS if it's going to go make its way through. And some of the complex papers, even as a MESSTATS editor, I will get sometimes outside expertise, and we'll get a PhD who's sort of sometimes outside our journal if there's something that's sort of unusual that we sort of need. So don't feel like you can't take something on because you aren't sure about what test was done. Oh. A poll. So retrospective study is essentially the same as a case control study. We had a little chat about, we were discussing this amongst ourselves sort of this morning. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. So simplest thing is sort of case control studies, pretty common in epidemiology, right? So For diseases that are very rare, that's kind of the only way that's the best way to sort of get it until now we're having big databases that may actually get us past that. A case control study is retrospective. You start with people who have the outcome, and you look back at sort of exposures, and then you figure out what controls you are going to match them to. And that is sort of a retrospective study. We talked about a term, someone was talking about a retrospective cohort, which is a term that pains me, but I see it all the time in all sorts of journals. But I think it's an oxymoron. So a cohort study is you start with the exposure and you march forward until people get the outcome. It is prospective by nature. But most of our prospective studies, we don't do them in real time. We take a database and we go back and we take a look. And so sometimes a better way to say is we did a cohort study with non-concurrent data collection or with retrospective data collection or using a database. And so you get around sort of using terms that may sort of confuse things for ourselves. Similar sort of when we talk about sort of trials and blinding, to say something's double blind is kind of meaningless. I want to know who was blinded because there's all sorts of people along the way. So there are so many common mistakes, and it really just depends on sort of the study design. So these are some common things I look at. So putting results into the method. So when the method starts to tell me about how many patients they enrolled and who they excluded, I'm like, that's results. In the methods, I want to know how you sampled patients, how you approached them, what you did to make sure you had capture, and then in the results, I want to know how you sort of did that. Poor organization and poor setting. So we talked about this a little bit with the introduction, right? If a paper is well organized, you can follow it along, right? I knew what they did, who they did it with, where they did it, how they did it, and it's much easier to figure out where there may be some biases. Can someone replicate it? Because there can be errors, there can be fraud. That's pretty hard to detect, but we can actually make papers clearer. And we are not necessarily the bearers of sort of who decides what is truth. It's always sort of changing, and our goal is to actually make the papers that get published sort of clear so someone else can sort of like then question that, right? We're always sort of retesting something. Sample sizes and post-hoc power calculations. So not every paper needs a sample size, right? It's sort of a figment, a little bit of what we talk about when we're doing statistical testing and sort of frequentist statistics. But it is also important in terms of what we think about effect sizes and measurement of effect and how succinct and how well we are sort of targeting our results. So helpful when you're thinking about modeling exercises, although we do question some of our rules in that. But post-hoc power calculations, they have, for the most part, fallen by the wayside, although sometimes they sneak in, and I will actually make those removed. And then the next thing I look for in the methodology is all of a sudden I get to the paragraph on analysis, and then there are, as in actually this paper, there are multiple statistical tests, one after another, and then they talk about, and we did a regression, and then we did a secondary analysis, and I was like, what question is this answering? Why are there all these sort of analyses? So I sort of will challenge the authors to say, like, any analysis that you have, I need to see the question that it's asking, and that needs to be stated a priori, as opposed to you sort of like fumbling through. And then also sort of testing of baseline characteristics is pretty common. There are some journals that still actually would do that in their table 1. There's a lot of reasons why we don't do that, and articles on that. And then sort of the exploratory testing. And sometimes you can read that in an article that people weren't quite sure what the question was. And I think, to a certain extent, journals have done this to people. We've sort of looking for the search for significance, because we think we have to have something that's significant for something to be able to say a p less than 0.05 so that we can publish our paper. And you don't necessarily need that, but I just sort of think we do want to understand the data and sort of where there may be sort of some biases. How are we doing time-wise? That was probably more than 5 minutes, and then we're going to get to results. Okay. Good. Questions? So I'll run through results really quickly. Yeah, sorry. So the results, again, similar to your method, should organize in sort of the same way. So it starts with how you enrolled, then it tells you sort of the demographics, then it tells you descriptively the main results, who had the outcomes, then it's your statistical analysis and your secondary analysis. So everything should flow in a logical order and should match what happened in the methods. The results should state the facts and not be editorial, and it should be clear. So absolute differences, not just the relative changes. And then this is really helpful as sort of yours, is checking all the numbers, because sometimes the abstract gets done before sort of got submitted to a conference and the numbers have changed. And so the abstract doesn't match the main tables or figures don't match sort of what's in the text. And so making sure that everything is clear. And then I'm always be aware of the dwindling and changing ends, because people start to talk about subgroups and they're reporting percentages, and you sort of start to lose what the N is. And so you want that to be clear. Do you know who they're talking about, what the group is, what that precision of measurement is? And then also ask yourself, once you get through it, wow, they collected all this data. Is there something I wanted to see? And so I think this is something that reviewers sort of don't always take advantage of, but sort of we were talking about this paper, what do you really want to sort of know? Or sort of we were talking earlier about splitting of data. And as a reviewer or editor, sometimes I'd be like, I saw that you collected all this data, I want to see this. You've given me one little snippet, you've given me the demographic information without giving me what I know is going to be the important analysis. And for this paper to be meaningful, there's enough room and I want to actually see that. Or I know you have data on demographics, and I want to see you split this data and show me how it was different for men and women. And you can ask for that, and you should feel comfortable to ask for that, especially if you are the content area in this, for this paper, sort of the content area expert. Is there something that they're missing that would actually make the paper stronger and better and actually make their points stronger, or may show for future people to sort of study something that sort of needed to be added? Or the next questions. And then think about graphs and tables. So, and this should go both ways. Is something better as a table or a figure, or is something better as text? A lot of text can be very dense. You do not want it to be redundant, but you really want to have a detailed figure can convey a lot more information about relationships than can a line of text. And so then you can also ask people to show more of the data. So if we were graphing sort of, I'm looking at a paper right now that was looking at sort of blood gases, and they sort of say, well, it may be different in people who are on oxygen. I'm like, well, all you need to do is sort of take your graph and color half the dots blue, because those are the people who are on oxygen, as opposed to just showing me all of the data. And as opposed to saying that I did a regression to figure out, did being on oxygen make this data different? It's like, actually show me what's sort of there. And so the more that people can sort of stratify the data or sort of split it, you think about this, you collect hundreds of data points on thousands of patients, and it comes down to like one page of results where they give you two numbers. And so try and get as close to the data and the richness of the data that you can, because that will help you out, and that'll help other sort of readers out, and it'll help the next investigators out. So common mistakes, failure to start with the table one, and the commentary, only 18% of the patients. Surprisingly, we found this. And then putting results in text that's too dense, and then redundancy. So the other thing too is tables and figures that show the same thing. Decide what's most important. Is it most important that the reader knows the exact number for those averages and estimates? Then a table's better. If it's really sort of you're looking at relationships between things, a well laid out graphic that has good axes will convey that information. And then I always look for new analyses that are sort of never mentioned anywhere in the methods, and to sort of pull that back for the same reason as sort of a methods that has analysis that wasn't mentioned in an objective. Post hoc data analysis. This could go lots of ways.
This is a question.
This is a poll for you.
Oh, yeah, I might have missed that one.
Yeah, okay, don't worry about it. So,
Next slide.
perfect. So I'll say it is done all the time. Sometimes there's a problem. You should not be searching for subgroup effects, but you have a big database, people will look at a lot of questions, and it is good for hypothesis generation.
Can I
Okay.
throw a story in here real quick?
Yeah.
And this has to do with Lancet. I see Mike is not here because he was talking about getting rejected from Lancet. So in the 1980s, most of you are not old enough for this, but there was a study called ISIS, the International Survival and Infarct Survival Study, something like that. And ISIS-2 compared thrombolytics and aspirin with nothing. And they submitted it to Lancet, and Lancet said, well, we want you to, this is great, 17,000 patients, and showed a clear benefit for thrombolytics and aspirin, and but we want you to do a subgroup analysis. And the author said, okay, fine, we'll do a subgroup analysis. And they did, they separated the data by astrological signs. And it turned out if you were, I believe I'm getting this right, Libra and Capricorn, you did better. But if you were an Aries or Taurus, one or the other, you did worse. And anyway, so be careful with subgroups.
Yes.
Okay, now I'm sorry. Oh, that's okay.
Now forget everything I said about not needing to know the statistics, and I was going to tell you that you need to know.
Can I ask a question in the meantime?
Yes.
Can you explain the rationale between not doing statistical testing on table 1?
Yeah. So why do you do an RCT?
Get rid of confounding variables of the ones,
Yeah.
confounding variables.
Unknown confounders. So if you do statistical testing, so it's not my hypothesis that these troop groups are going to be different. I don't have 50 hypotheses that they're going to be different on sex and gender. Confounding can exist even if the p is greater than 0.05. And most of the confounders we don't sort of know. So for a lot of reasons, it's not sort of the right sort of, it doesn't tell you on either end that the groups are similar or not similar in the ways that you need to know. And in most, yeah.
It's not the hypothesis of the paper.
Right. Right. And if you test a bunch of things, you're going to come up with stuff that's sort of important, that may seem important or not. And so it's important to look at. And the same thing is when you get to sort of observational studies, it's sort of even worse because there's all sorts of confounder. And so there's a lot of reasons why statistical testing for differences in observational groups that are defined merely because these are the oranges and these are the apples doesn't make sense. And the software package doesn't know that. It will spit out a p-value. You tell it what to do, it'll do that. But it sort of does not get to what you're actually asking about.
So is it a true statement that you should only be doing statistical testing on your research hypothesis and nothing else?
Yes, well, also, and I'm not a big frequentist sort of statistics, so I think, sort of like every piece of data we get, it adds to our knowledge. And so sort of like in a Bayesian way, we sort of start to increase our knowledge by sort of doing all of that. By sort of each time we do it, everything adds to it, and it's sort of, then we get sort of closer to it.
A reviewer who says they did statistical testing on table 1, and I don't think they should have, is that a valid criticism, or is it not?
Is it about, well, I mean, they can say it, but I mean, if it came to annals, I'd be like, nix that column.
Yeah.
3 words. It's a style thing. There are journals that still publish it that way, so.
Yeah, but I think as a peer reviewer, you want to look at table 1, and if you see big differences between certain groups, you might want to question as to whether that might be a confounding variable or lead to confounding in the results. So.
Yes,
and whether you have a statistical value is sort of immaterial because, as we mentioned, the more tests you do, the more likely you are to have a statistically significant result that means nothing.
Right, and really, you need thousands of patients for the groups to actually sort of even out. So we're like, oh, we did an RCT with 500 patients. You're not really sort of going to even out sort of the confounders anyways, really, sort of for most of that testing.
All right, stats. Does this microphone work?
Yes.
All right, I don't. Well, we'll see. All right, hi, I'm Rob Ehrman. I love stats, so someone might have to get like the crook out to pull me off if I just keep talking because I could.
I tried to make the slides short.
That's immaterial for me. So, for me, you're right, methods and stats are sort of inextricably linked. The one thing to remember, well, a couple things to remember is, complicated, complex statistical analyses cannot make up for poorly done studies, poor methodology, poorly conceived studies. Just because something is complicated doesn't mean it's correct or the best. That's one thing to remember. Something else, too, that I think it behooves us all to sort of understand is that there's a lot of confusion around statistics and methods to some extent because there are different terms for the same concepts that are used by different fields. So, a common one you guys have all probably heard about is, relative risk versus risk ratio. Like, those are the same things. Different fields tend to refer to them in one way or the other, but there's it creates a lot of confusion because there are a lot of names for the same test, Kruskal-Wallace test or Mann-Whitney-U and all these different things. Again, they're the same kind of test, but they have different names and it can be confusing. And so I bring this up just to sort of say, it's okay if you don't feel overwhelmed. There are a lot of people that still get confused. I still get confused sometimes when I'm reading something, I have to go look something else up. So I do think it's important to learn a little bit of basic statistics. It helps you read papers better. It helps you write papers better. It helps you understand other papers that are out there so that you can produce better research. I gotta put this down, it feels weird. So obviously I can't, present an entire like statistics curriculum in 10 minutes. But my general take home for you guys from this would be every time you read a paper, try to learn one sort of statistical concept or one kind of idea. So, right, there's these different data types: continuous, discrete, nominal, ordinal. Do you guys know what some or all of those are? Right? Yeah, good. And so there are always statistical tests that go with specific types of data. And maybe you know what frequency data is, but maybe you're not sure what the difference between a chi-square test and a Fisher's exact test is. And so again, it's a little teeny tiny thing, but if you learn just a little bit from each paper you review, at the end of a year or two, you will learn a lot more. All right, this is a question.
What do you think about using ChatGPT to find the answers to that? Because I often do that, and then I'm wondering, do I then have to verify with another source rather than going to a text to read about it?
That's a great question. I don't know, maybe I'm not a Luddite, but I've never interacted with ChatGPT. It's probably fine. I mean, I've seen people that write like R code using ChatGPT and find solutions to their coding problems. So it's probably fine, like with an asterisk, because again, there's a lot of similar, one, because I've never done it, and two, there's a lot of similar sounding tests. Chi-squared gets, there's chi-squared test of trend, and there's different types of chi-squared, and so whether or not it's really telling you the one that you're actually asking about, I'm not sure. But usually if you Google, like it's your friend, you can find those things.
ChatGPT is like Google, but it's gives you like a paragraph, if it's accurate.
Did you have a question?
Or I was just going to say, Wikipedia is always very, very well done for all of these.
Okay, what do you guys think? Is it?
A lot of big universities will have a homepage that you can hit, will give you information too.
UCLA has a good online stats curriculum where you can look up a lot of stuff. So does, I think, University of Virginia has good homepages, or have good, their biostats departments have a lot of good stuff, ranging from very simple to very complex.
Is this one working? Is this slide working?
I've got one on here, but I don't know why it's on the slide.
Which is better? Less than 0.001 or less than 0.1?
Anything is true. All right, good. Let's move on.
All right. Right. I mean, it's a trick question, right? Because p-values have nothing to do with, I blew it. Has nothing to do with effect size. So I mostly do frequentist statistics, and I don't really think there's anything wrong with p-values. I think you have to understand what they are and what they are not, and then you can decide for yourself in which situations they're okay and which situations they're not. I don't actually like this definition of p-values because it's sort of like a shortcut, and it kind of gets you 3/4 of the way there, but that last 1/4 is where things really kind of break down if you don't fundamentally understand it. And again, I think if you're going to review papers, most of them are going to be frequentist statistics, and you should kind of understand the basics of it. So p-value, I mean, this is sort of true. But it's also more technically, it's the probability of obtaining the observed results if the null hypothesis were true. And everybody kind of hates that, the null hypothesis testing, because it's wait, what is that? But, I would tell you, if you're going to review papers and you're going to be a researcher and you're going to be a writer, you should learn frequentist statistics, the basics, so that you can understand the more technical definitions. Because again, that will help you when the sort of shortcuts kind of break down, and it's like Dr. Cooper was saying with this, this post hoc power calculation thing, everybody has kind of gotten these little shortcuts, these rules of thumb into their head as things that you must do. Like every paper must have a power calculation, and mostly that's nonsense, right? Most papers probably shouldn't unless it's done prospectively, like ahead of time. Another one is, have you guys heard this like events per variable ratio of 10-to-1 for like a logistic regression? Does anybody know where that came from? No, right? It's like a really old paper, or it's a really old, someone kind of made the statement, and in fact, there's been a number of studies subsequently where they found that 5-to-1 is probably okay outside of a few situations. It doesn't mean you should try to like fill up your model with variables. But again, you'll still get papers back, comments from reviewers that say, oh, your model's overfit because you violated this 10-to-1 rule. And it's just like all these things like in medicine persist because somebody said it once and then we all kind of did it. And, but I think it's incumbent upon us to kind of learn these newer things so that we can understand when we should, what stuff from the past we should keep and what stuff we should throw away. Okay, so remember that a p-value is telling you not whether your study is true in the universe, not about the effect size. It has to do with, like I said, the probability of getting the result you got under the conditions in which you ran your test if the null hypothesis were true. So most of the time the null hypothesis is that there was no difference. And again, the important thing to remember, I think, is that it's all based on the way in which you did your experiment. So if you had a really poorly done study, a really biased study, you can still get a highly significant p-value, by which I mean far less than 0.05, but that doesn't make it true. Multiple comparisons, again, there's these kind of rules of thumb that says, yes, you always should do it. You guys know the problem with multiple comparisons, why people don't like them. Anybody shout it out?
I find it useful when there are multiple comparisons being used, that I will highlight all the ones that are where the p-value is statistically significant, and then I'll just do a little count, and I'll see, if there were 20 comparisons and 3 of them were statistically significant, I'll say, well, I think that probably could have occurred by chance alone, even though it was statistically significant in this case. It was possible that this just occurred by chance and isn't really the true outcome.
Right, so it's like the more null hypothesis you test, the greater the likelihood that you will find one that's statistically significant. And it's not additive, it's actually multiplicative. So by the time I think it's like you do 13 tests, you have a 50% chance of having one that's at least less than, that's statistically significant. Again, there's some people.
In this paper, there were at least 6 pairwise comparisons between the races. And then if you add the 6 pairwise comparisons to the death, intubation, COVID positivity, perhaps there's 18 comparisons.
Right. And so, and they did do some multiple comparison adjustments, but I'll move on in a second, I swear. There are statisticians that study this kind of stuff, and I can send you guys a paper about it, but the short answer is that sometimes you should adjust for multiple comparisons and sometimes you shouldn't. And there are very well published and well-respected statisticians and epidemiologists who study this stuff. Some of it is going to be journal dependent in what you're looking, what you're kind of looking to prove, but it's like a reflex. The answer is not always yes, multiple comparison adjust. These are all important things. I think Dr. Cooper kind of touched on some of this stuff, but we're interested not just in statistical significance, but on magnitude of treatment effect. You want a point estimate from your study, and you want some sort of measure of uncertainty. So that's usually confidence intervals. If you want to know all about confidence intervals, I have a didactic on Friday it's all about confidence intervals, nothing else. So you could come and get your hair blown off. Absolute versus relative change. You guys kind of get the idea that relative changes can be enormous, but whether or not that change is clinically significant remains to be seen. Odds ratios and relative risks, they often get used interchangeably, but they're not. Odds ratios tend to overestimate relative risk. Again, there's some technical details. In general, the thing you should think about as you kind of start out is odds ratios, go with case control studies. But people sometimes get thrown sometimes odds ratios come up in like logistic regression or something like that. But again, these things are, maybe some of this is going in one ear, out the other, but hopefully some of you guys are sort of sparked to think more about this stuff. Next time you read a paper, say, oh, you know what, I should look that up. All right. Sensitivity, specificity, and likelihood ratios, we tend to, when we're talking about diagnostic tests, we like these things. Predictive values, we tend not to like them. The reason being is that predictive values are heavily dependent on prevalence. So if you have a very low prevalence of some outcome, you can have a really good negative predictive value, and that doesn't really tell you anything about the test. It just tells you that an outcome is really uncommon. You hear all the time that sensitivity and specificity are not impacted by prevalence, and like many things in statistics, that's kind of true, mostly true. There's this idea of spectrum bias, which is more the idea that diagnostic tests perform differently depending on how severe the disease is. So sort of the classic example is like throat swabs for strep. Like, do you think they're pretty good or not so good, pretty bad? Terrible. Well, yeah, kind of. But that depends upon like the severity of the disease. They did this study, I think it was published in Annals many, many years ago, like the 90s or maybe even the 80s, but where it basically found that if you have mild disease by like zero center criteria, the sensitivity and specificity are awful. And by the time you get to all 4 center criteria, you've got these big gooey tonsils, right? The test does pretty well. And what's that? Right, exactly. And the point is, we tend to think of diagnostic tests as being this infallible yes or no binary thing, and the truth is, in many cases, that's not always true. Likelihood ratios tell you, a positive likelihood ratio tells you how much more likely you are to have disease given a positive test, and then negative likelihood is the opposite of that. ROC curves is sort of the trade-off between sensitivity and specificity, and it's essentially presents a graph of that. Obviously, you want to, 0.5 is basically useless. It's like the flip of a coin. The higher you get, the larger your number is, the better. Regression modeling, yeah, it's complicated, but you should learn it because it's kind of like one of the cornerstones of statistical analysis. Like so many papers include it. The basics, the very basics of it is that it's looking at a bunch of, I'm kind of going over on time. I'm not going to get into this, but it is worthwhile looking into this, and I guess the last thing I would say would just be, if you don't understand something, that's okay. You're not expected to be a statistician. Ask if you know some stuff about stats. And something doesn't make sense when you read the paper, it's okay to say that. So like, can you clarify why you chose, why you modeled your binary outcome as a continuous, used a continuous outcome for what sounds like it should be binary? I mean, there are some cases when that's done, but just ask it in a friendly way, look it up, but also ask for a stats reviewer. That's okay, that's what you should do. Don't just assume because something is complicated and long-winded that it's correct. We were talking about this at our table, but sort of with this paper, it's just like, it's complicated and it becomes one of those things where like nobody wants to be like, sorry, this is confusing, what's going on here? If no reviewer like puts their hand up or submits a comment that says like, I don't really follow your analytic plan, can we get like a more experienced reviewer? Sometimes they sneak through. There are some easy online stats calculators that you can use. As you get kind of curious if something really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, you can play around and you actually can find some errors in there. It's certainly not your job, but again, as you start to like learn a little bit more, hopefully this has sparked a little bit of interest in somebody to kind of think through some of these ideas. Yeah. So my last thing is, like I said, you should always try to learn one little tiny statistical concept. I promise you that I was a lousy medical student, and when we did like the biostats method stuff at the end of first year, I thought I was going to fail out of medical school because I couldn't understand sensitivity and specificity. I would like cry at home for like a week, and now I mostly understand it. So anyway, any questions about that stuff?
So it's great. And sort of when I get to like with less than 0.05. So the biggest thing to think about is sort of what is bias, right? Bias is the non-random introduction of error into your measurement. And the biggest threat to most papers is not the random chance error that a p less than 0.05 tells you about. It tells you nothing about that. And p less than 0.05, 50% of the time, that would not even replicate in the same study. So it is not that magical. And you don't need to know the stats. You really need to know, like, have they enrolled the right patients? Have they measured things correctly? Because that's going to be most of the bias is going to be in how they didn't select the right population or how we've looked at things. And so it is daunting. And, you know, I read this on the plane and I was like, this paper, I was like, oh, this is going to be like interesting. Even I, like reading through it, I'm sort of like, you know, if I get lost in sort of some of what's done, and I'm doing a lot of reading, and 25 years of MES stats, and I still look up other methods and read other papers when I'm sort of doing stuff, and I consult, we have a group of MES stats, we have like now like 10 of them. We sort of will sometimes have our own discussions and sometimes get an outside expert. So you are not expected to know that. But as Rob said, sort of the key is sort of like, you know, complicated is not better. In fact, if you have to use a bunch of fancy statistics to prove to me your point, you're probably hiding something, is sort of how I feel. Like I want to see it and see it all the way through, see it replicated multiple times in multiple ways.
So we just spoke about stats and methods, but not all papers have stats and these particular methods, right? You might be called upon to review a scoping review or a meta-analysis that has totally different stats, or a qualitative study that has totally different methods. And I don't want you to say no just for any of these methods just because you don't know the methods, because there's always a methods review person. So your job is to simply be honest about whether or not you can be critical of the methods. If you read the paper and you've got something to say about everything else and the methods are foreign to you, that's great. You just say that. You say, listen, this is my comments for the discussion, this is my comments for the intro, and I really can't be critical of the methods because I'm not a qualitative reviewer. That's still super helpful. It's way better than ignoring the methods and pretending that you understand the methods, because there are, you know, specific methods for things that we don't, you know, for types of papers that we don't review, and I don't want you to discourage you from reviewing them.
If I could add, so the only thing I would say is if you're really not familiar with qualitative research, I think you should just not take that paper on, because it's its own kind of research. And
just like these ones, I'll get a reviewer who is a qualitative methods expert to make sure the methods are good. I would love to have some who are, but I don't necessarily.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure just having someone who's an expert qualitative reviewer is enough. If you don't really understand the way that qualitative research is conducted, what it means, how people use it, I just think it's better to have someone who does, as opposed to depend on the reviewer. And now, of course, in emergency medicine, we don't do that much qualitative research, but you know, in education research, it's pretty common, and so I just found that in general, people who aren't familiar with qualitative research, is better to just hand it over to someone who is.
Right. And like all things, there's always like a little bit of healthy, you know, differences of opinion or, you know, disagreements, and I don't mean that in any pejorative way. I think, you know, to sort of Liz's point about earlier, is that it is a, you know, if you want to be a qualitative researcher, if that's what you're interested in, and you start reading these papers, it's an opportunity for, you know, for you to learn, and, you know, you may not be the, I don't know, you know, the reviewer that's making the, you know, you probably shouldn't make big sweeping overarching comments about how this is terrible or how this is awesome, but, you know, it's a chance to learn, you know, and kind of further the field, but always be honest about what you know and what you don't know. And look up the stuff that interests you. Like, I got a master's in biostats after I'd been attending for a few years because I got like interested in this stuff. And now the most, you know, what I get the most enjoyment of is, you know, reading stat stuff. And so other people will find stuff that is interesting to you. So.
Yeah. And I would kind of agree with both David and Elizabeth in that, you know, we're emergency physicians and we're educators, so we kind of know what is going on in these studies. even though we may not know all the details of how a good qualitative study is done, but we still have a sense of, are they asking the right questions? Are they looking at the right population? Did they make a reasonable effort to get a large enough sample size? Those are the kinds of things that you don't need to be a qualitative review. I mean, that's the exact numbers of what's reasonable, but we have a sense of, in our own departments, if you ask 3 people, that's probably not a reasonably good sample. But what would be a reasonably good sample? Well, 20 or 50, and that might vary a little bit with the setting.
Just a quick question to sort of bring that concept home. If you get a qualitative paper and they interviewed 19 subjects of human trafficking until they reached the thematic saturation, if you're the reviewer, it's not a good idea to say sample size is too small, reject. And that's what I've gotten. So I think between the two of you, accept that there are qualitative methods, that there's a science to it, learn about it, and don't reject on small sample size when it's otherwise done well, which is why I said it.
Quantitative, you said, well, 19 subjects, you can't say anything.
Right.
It's not really true for qualitative.
We have to understand the concept of thematic saturation, which I suspect a lot of... Good. And hopefully we've gotten you excited about doing that and attending that. It's a fascinating topic, and it's an interesting field of research, and it's something that I think that we should be doing more of in emergency medicine. But on that note, let's go back to this paper and see how they did on the methods and the results section. And we'll get together in about 15 minutes. Yeah, oh yeah, very nice. Excellent. Okay. We're starting to run out of time, and we've built in a buffer at the end where we can kind of do a little more back and forth between groups. But I noticed that most of the groups were really focusing on the methodology of the study, of this giant database. Not so much focusing on what the ROC curves mean necessarily, but we'll come back to that later, or don't mean. Right. So we're going to talk about the end up.
So we're going to talk about discussions and limitations and conclusions. I only have 2 slides on discussion, so I really invite everybody to add their thoughts, because I actually think that this is a place where there's going to be a lot of variability in terms of like what one person thinks you should do as a reviewer and what someone else thinks you should do as a reviewer. So we're going to, so please, that is my plea to actually interrupt and feel free to disagree with me. An annoying thing about the discussion from a reviewer perspective is that it shouldn't necessarily sync the paper because it can be changed, right? So we just talked about the methods, and if the methods, and the study design really mostly, if the study design is crap, like it sort of sinks the whole project. But if the study design is sound and they do a crappy job in the discussion, then your job as a reviewer is actually much harder, because you just saw, oh, well, the methods are actually pretty good, they just did a crappy job in the discussion, and now I need to give them more feedback on how they need to fix the discussion. Whereas if the study design is terrible, your job is actually really easy, because you just say, the study design doesn't work, I'm done, reject, right? So you can do a lot here for a paper as long as everything else is sound, which makes it a little harder, if that makes sense. So to some degree, the peer review discussion of this actually totally mirrors the manuscript writing course that is also on Friday, I believe. So if you go to that and you go to this, then you sort of like know what it's supposed to look like, and then you're looking for sort of what it's supposed to look like. But basically, I like to see the beginning of the discussion talks about what is that primary finding, what was your primary outcome, and starting with that, and now you get to talk about why it's important. And obviously the big things that you're watching for is people overstating the importance and overstating their findings. But they're going to tell you what was the primary thing that they want people to take home from this paper and why. And then they need to start putting it in context. And obviously they touched on some of that context in the intro, but they're not necessarily going to fill the intro with the lit review. Your intro should not be a lit review, and neither should your discussion. But at the same time, you cannot just talk about
your study in a vacuum. You have to put in the context of what came before. So how is it different from one paper? How is it similar to another paper? Or how does it take somebody else's work one step further? And then, talking about effect size in here. If this effect size is true, what are the implications for that? If this effect size is exaggerated, what are the implications for public health, for whatever your thing is? This is your place to explain implications further. So this is where you want to see people do that. But at the same time, you don't want them to take it too far, right? This should all be within moderation. And this is where I think we have some differences of opinion. Is it okay for people to editorialize? I think it's okay for people to editorialize, but it has to be clear that it's them editorializing, such as these findings could suggest that maybe this, but an alternative explanation is this, right? So they're putting it out there that all these things are possibilities, but they're not saying that their data proved that this was what happened, okay? And then the discussion should not just be a repetition of the results, and that's really painful for everyone to read. And similarly, the discussion should not be the first place that you learn about something. This we see all the time, where they've done something. This happens in qualitative, this happens in quantitative. They've done something, there was some little side thing that they also did that maybe it's buried in a table or maybe it's not, and then they bring it up in the discussion and they say, isn't it interesting that we also found that blank? And you're like, no, the discussion is not the first place that I should see a result. So anything that is a result should not be in the methods, should not be in the discussion, should be in the results, and then you can talk about it in the discussion. And I think I'm gonna stop there for a second. What other thoughts do people have about things that bother them when they see them in discussions?
Good writing.
Yeah, good writing, right? So the writing should be clear. People get to think a little bit more and be a little bit more creative. So the writing should be easy to read, like with everything that we said, and should make sense and should flow. I had a mentor, yeah, go ahead.
Just a comment, the overreaching comment that you already made, saying that the paper showed things that it didn't, is very common with junior authors and have to rein them in. Everybody's passionate about their project they've been working on for 2 or 3 years. Good for you, but you didn't actually study that.
Right.
And so you can only make conclusions that you studied, and your editorializing should be 1 or 2 sentences at most at the end.
Right. I had a mentor who, and I don't remember actually the framework exactly, but gave me a very specific paragraph by paragraph framework for discussions. You're going to start with your main finding, and you're going to talk about the implications of that, and you're going to talk about how it fits in the research. Then you've got space for 1 or 2 of sort of your sub-findings and how they might be important. You got to talk about what the future research is about, maybe a little bit of editorializing, and then the limitations, and that's it. That's sort of all you get. This slide says stuff we've already said. So we're interpreting. Our job as a reviewer, sometimes the discussion is all over the place, but I actually think it's just as difficult when there's not enough discussion and you're like, come on, you need to give me a little bit more because people are going to read this. Too much extrapolation. Like we said, there can be some editorializing, but it really needs to be clear that it's editorializing. And then obviously, yes, if it's negative, what does that mean? Were you simply underpowered and you think that more research is warranted, or did you actually learn something from your negative study? This is a great place. If you had a negative study, if you can really explain the importance of the negative study, that makes your paper more likely to get published. Oh wait, this negative study is really important because you know what we didn't do and I wish we had done, and if we had done this, maybe our study wasn't negative. That's really relevant for the literature and for the person that's taking that next step. And that may be the thing that convinces someone to accept the paper. So that needs to be there. And then really, future research directions, I think, is super important. And it's also really good for you because usually it's like you as the writer and that person as, they need to tell you that because that's what they're going to do next. And their paper supports them in doing that thing next. So encouraging people to actually hit that point when they do their discussion, I think, is important. I think you're first, Rob.
Just a couple quick things. Like you said, if it's too meandering, there's always that sweet spot between just enough detail but not too much. One of my kind of pet peeves is a discussion where you have to put your results in the context of others, but you don't have to say Jones et al. Found this and Smith et al. Found this, and list out 9 things, and you get to the end of that paragraph, and you're like, wait, what? Like, it's okay if there are a lot of other studies in that field, but say prior studies have studied this. Ours is different because of X, and therefore our findings are, novel or, useful for X reason. And then suggesting future research directions is critical, but it can't just be like, if research is needed. You should, the future, you should suggest what those future directions are. You should suggest what the implications might be and how you might do that. Because again, one, I think it's if papers that do that, it shows that the person or the author group that they're thinking through like a trajectory of research, not just a one-off study. But again, it helps to understand if you're not the absolute content expert, like where this falls in kind of again that trajectory, rather than just, well, we had a small study, but you should do more. We need a larger sample size. It's like give me more. That's not
right. Need something else?
Most of what Rob said was about to say, so I'll agree with you.
Sorry.
Yeah, I would say it's a common thing I see in discussion, those that people will just go blanket listing of here's all the things that we've done before. So it's okay to summarize them. I think it's also important to contextualize it. So our findings differ. Should not be the last thing said and it's just done next paragraph. It should be like, why? What are the implications? And that's one of the things that like a reviewer, I'll push them on too, and say, okay, so yours differed from these 7 other papers. Why? Why do you think that happened? What are the implications? What is that now? What should that have us think about? You have to be careful not to over-editorialize that, but I think we do need, if there's a discordance between prior literature, that needs a discussion. That should just be like, oh, okay, we were different. Moving on. So I'll often push them as a reviewer to kind of like delve into that a little bit.
Yeah, and this is why this is a hard part to do a good job with, because there's just this breadth of what they could say and what they should say, and like there's a lot in there. So you have to understand what they did, and then you have to know a little bit about this area of research to really help them write a good discussion. But hopefully they've written such a good discussion that is easy. So if you're finding it hard, then clearly they need more help in their discussion. All right, I'm going to hand this over.
I think like the very best papers will like set that up in the intro so that it leaves you thinking like, oh, look at all these flaws or look at all these limitations in this field. Like we need something a little bit different, and then you can tie it in at the end. And it says like, or it show like, we have kind of filled this gap and help kind of push the field forward.
Anybody else on discussion? No? Okay. So I'm going to talk about some of what sometimes get glossed over as the smaller, simpler parts of papers, but really I think they are some of the meatiest and most important. First one being limitations. And this is something that I think particularly when you're starting out as a reviewer, this is an area where your opinion and your interpretation of what someone has provided can really help make a paper better and can really help validate what it was that they said they did through their methods and through everything else that they have described prior to this. Truly, when I'm reading papers that I get to peer review, I get concerned when I read a paper that doesn't have an in-depth discussion of their limitations, because what does that tell me? That tells me that they don't have the insight to think about the methodology that they use to prove the point that they are now trying to present as truth. And so that's why I feel like limitations in particular are very important. And it's something that you don't need to have an advanced degree in statistics to be good at kind of looking at somebody else's work and trying to, in a supportive, constructive way, poke holes in it. So the biggest things that you want to make sure that you are addressing when you are going through somebody's limitations is, did they address any threats to their internal validity of their study? And also importantly, did they address any threats to the external validity of their study? Because this is going to matter when it comes to other people reading what they try to publish and whether or not it's going to apply to their practice. This is where your limitations section becomes so important. So this is also where you want to make sure that they've addressed any biases that may influence the effect size that they are reporting in their literature. This is also an area where you want to check and make sure that it's obvious that they were thinking about what they were doing in the way that they set this up so that they are actually proving what they said they set out to prove. So in the paper that we're discussing today, this is kind of a great example because when we look at the registry that they use to sort of build out their data set, the discussion that we've been having at our table is, can this even prove what they said that they set out to prove? And we don't really see that well discussed in their limitations. So again, very, very, very important thing that you can do to make sure that the paper that is in front of you is solid. And also that if you're going to provide some feedback to these authors, this is an area where providing some feedback on their limitations can really improve a paper that otherwise is not in its current state publishable. And as somebody who's been on the receiving end of some of these reviews where they point out limitations that I did not see, I honestly really appreciate it. And I was like, oh, I didn't even think about that. This gives me an opportunity to review what we did and sort of better flesh that out for the next set of reviewers who then think that my discussion was way better, who then think that my project was way better because I had addressed all of these things. So again, usually a small section, but this section is incredibly important. And again, we kind of talked about various journal formats and where this is going to kind of fall in line, whether it's in the discussion or it's its own separate section. And then we kind of already talked about we were going to make sure that we point out any limitations that we see to a study that maybe the authors didn't see. And again, this is something that you can do that really helps to improve papers that are kind of otherwise on the fence or on the borderline. All right. So I think everybody's kind of aware of this, but just to reiterate, your limitations should not be where you're first finding out about other pieces of data from the project. So there should be no results that are getting reported there that weren't previously in the results section, no methodology reported in the limitations that wasn't previously in the methodology. If any of this shows up in the limitations section and is not in the other appropriate sections of the paper, that should be something that you highlight for the authors and that you point out as a reason to not have it published in its current state. That is something that's going to need to be revised. Yes?
Question about that. What about sensitivity analyses? So like, in the results, we did a thing in the discussion, or like methods, we did a thing, results, here's some of the results we got, discussion, a little bit of editorializing, like this was kind of weird, we thought it was kind of weird. Limitations, this was weird, we did a sensitivity analysis to show that it wasn't actually that weird. Like, is that still valid? Or like, it's new results, but it's...
Yeah. Because again, like, that should be mentioned prior to when you're coming to the point of your paper where you're trying to let everybody know that you thought about the reasons why everything you did might have some areas where they don't apply or some problems with what you presented. I don't want to know, because that also would make me as a reviewer, if I read that, think that this is probably your second round of reviews, that somebody else told you that you had to comment on this and you didn't go back and do the whole paper.
And I see the limitation section as a place where I can say, okay, in future, we have to fix these things to make a better study. That, our study had these limitations, and it would be wise for future researchers to correct those when doing the next study to build on our results.
And also, you're keeping people who read it from making generalizations about your study.
Right.
You don't, like, if someone's going to take your study to the press, like, you want to make
And they do.
sure that the limit that your study is not misinterpreted as being too much in one direction. Like, everything has limitations, and so you're really trying to force people to understand that.
Yeah, and kind of to Elizabeth's point earlier, part of the importance of doing peer review is there are many other people who are not going to have the time to sort of delve through these papers in a very intentional and thoughtful manner. They are just going to see what gets published, wait for journal feed to tell them what they should know about that paper, and then potentially incorporate it into their practice. And so you are sort of like the last defense against bad data that results in bad medicine. So if you can do anything to sort of help people understand why a study might not apply to them or their practice, this section's your chance to do it. And by this section, I mean limitations, which was on the slide prior. Any other questions about limitations? Yes?
Every paper has limitations, and I think it's obviously you always have to write about it, but I think there's also a role to write about your strengths too. I usually try to do that before my limitations.
Correct, that's the discussion section. Yes.
I feel like people don't often do that. They often sometimes do trash their own paper.
Yeah, and there's a degree of like self-negging that's okay in the limitations section, but I know what you mean where somebody's like, hey, look at our results, they're great. our paper's terrible for all these reasons, absolutely irrecoverable, and you're like, do you want me to publish this? Yeah, so, okay, so conclusion. Also typically just a couple sentences, but a very important section of your paper. And so personally, my process when I do reviews is I read the abstract and then I read the conclusion. And then for the rest of my first read through of whatever paper I'm reviewing, I'm looking to make sure that everything lines up with those two sections. And it is shocking how many times people will write in their conclusion something that never shows up like in the rest of the paper or doesn't accurately reflect what they reported in their abstract, right? And ultimately, these are sort of the Cliff's Notes versions of papers that people without a lot of time are going to want to read. So conclusion in particular, you want to make sure accurately reflects what people reported in their data, in their methods, in their discussion. And this is where you want to make sure that people aren't overselling themselves or what they did. Because another thing that you will find very often in conclusion is people will say, well, we proved pulse ox is different for people of different skin colors and doesn't read accurately. Well, did this study actually prove that? Can you actually prove something written that way with a retrospective study? You want to make sure that whatever the authors are reporting in their conclusion, they actually had a study that was set up to provide that kind of data. And especially for people who, when I read, I think are probably newer authors or more junior faculty, especially with retrospective studies, this comes up all the time where they will say, we proved this. Because of our study, we think that you should change practice this way. You can't do that with a retrospective study. And so it's as simple as changing a couple words to make sure that they are not overstating their findings, but man, is it important, because if they don't do that, then one day you're gonna see something written on CNN about how eggs cause cancer or something like that, because the person who then takes this and runs with it doesn't understand that you can only gain associations, not prove anything from a retrospective study. But so yes, conclusions also, short, straight to the point, unlike my current talk. Couple sentences, and by convention, for the most part, you don't want any references in your conclusion. So sometimes I'll see people start to throw in a couple more references. This is not the place for it. It should be in your discussion, in your intro. If it's a methodology thing, it should be in the body of your paper. But yeah, conclusion, super important, super short. Make sure that you give this a good look through when you are reviewing papers, and make sure that it is supported by everything else that is in that paper as you go through it. All right, in conclusion, any other thoughts on conclusions?
Just a quick thought. The conclusion in the abstract should be almost the same as the conclusion in the paper.
Yes, correct. They should, if they are wildly different, that is a problem.
There's no reason they can't be the same words.
Correct, yeah. Because really, like, brevity is everybody's friend when it comes to conclusions. And so last but not least, I'm going to talk a little bit about references, which is a thing that I feel like gets glossed over sometimes. And the more I do this, the more I realize there's a lot of room for some sketchy stuff to happen in the references. So if you think about it, right, everybody's project or paper or whatever it is that they've embarked on that you're peer reviewing is based on other people's work. So it is like the foundation of what you are doing. So the references should, in a very easily identifiable way, support what it is that you have embarked on. So I would encourage you, when you are peer reviewing, to take a few minutes and all of the big heavy hitting points that support the pursuit of this project, make sure that you look at all those references, even just for a few minutes, and make sure that they actually say what the people writing the paper purport that they say. It's amazing how many times people will reference something that supports sort of the call to action for why they are writing their paper, and then you go and read the reference and you're like, that's not what it says at all. You've completely misinterpreted that, and if this is the basis for the study that you are currently doing, your study is probably way off base if you can't even interpret the reference on which it's, entirely set up on. The other thing you want to make sure, especially now as people try and use more apps and assistance in creating their papers, the same reference isn't mentioned multiple times to kind of increase the numbers of references that they have to meet certain journal criteria. You also want to make sure that their paper isn't supported by a bunch of references from 30 years ago, especially if you know that there's something that has come out more recently that is very much applicable to this study. So for example, at our table, we were discussing how this paper should have included another reference on pulse oximetry and skin color that came out in 2022, but it doesn't. And so this would be something that as a reviewer you would definitely want to mention, this is within the scope of what you're doing. Why did you decide not to reference this person? Or maybe you should consider including this reference. This is also sort of the section where if you know of a reference that contradicts something that the authors are saying, this is your opportunity to sort of provide that to them and say, well, paper X by so-and-so is contradictory to this statement that you made. You may want to consider including it in your references and addressing why you disagree with their stance on this, right? So references can get a little dense, especially when you're doing a review that has like 116 of them, but just kind of glance through it, make sure there's no repeats of the same reference multiple times, and then for any of the heavy-hitting statements that the authors are making, if they have a reference, make sure to read that reference quickly and make sure that it is actually interpreted correctly and applies to what it is that they say that they're doing. Absolutely.
Multiple references?
Yeah.
Why is that if sometimes there are multiple points made in a paper that is useful?
No, so like I had a review that I got, and I was just double checking some of their statements, and they had like references 6, 7, 8, and 9, and references 6, 8, and 9 were all the same paper, but the citation had clearly been pulled from different places, and they just didn't read that the title of the paper and the authors and the year it was published were all the same. It's just that one came directly from the Springer website and one came from PubMed. It was the same paper. And so that kind of changes it because it took away like 3 of the references that they were trying to use to support something. It like raises concerns for me, like how closely did you look this over before you submitted it? And then like, did you really try to, stretch the number of references that you had for the statement that you're making that you're trying to use to support your entire paper? Like, did you knowingly do this? So that's kind of why I checked there to make sure everything sort of seems to align the way that it should within the paper itself, if that makes sense.
Okay, but it's not a problem if you have a paper and you're referring to that.
Oh, no. Sometimes papers are really good and get referenced 10 times for what you're doing because it provides, a heavy basis for what it is that you've decided to pursue. I'm talking about you can't say that citation, 6 through 10 are different references when they are all in fact the same paper. Yeah. Any other reference questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So when do you do your own mini search? Like sometimes I'll wonder, geez, it seems like there ought to be more about this particular topic. And I'll do a quick Google search, and I'm always shocked by how many times I find a current reference, not necessarily this year, but within the last couple of years, that wasn't mentioned in the paper.
Yeah, and so sometimes too what you'll end up finding as you start digging through people's references is that they found one review and then they pulled all the references from that one review, because then when you look at the rest of the references that they have for the paper, there aren't many. So that lets me know you just found one review that you liked and you did not actually do a literature review for this paper. So again, it just depends on you and how judgy and angry you're feeling that day. But I like to kind of lean into my role as reviewer number 2 and be a little picky. But yeah, it's an area that gets glossed over that I think there's still a lot that you can look at that can be identified to help improve papers and make sure there is validity to the product that's being put in front of you. So I usually do it for every paper I review. Yeah.
Yeah, probably a good idea.
Yeah, I think so. Especially you'll find papers that were written and you're like, oh my God, this is like the exact same thing. Did you know that this just came out 6 months ago, before you're trying to publish your findings?
It also helps you build your expertise.
Yes.
If you're reviewing in a kind of a narrow area, like looking through all those, like all the references and stuff, like you're going to build your knowledge base, you're going to build your expertise.
Very much so.
And it'll take less and less time as you go along, as long as you're kind of sticking in the same area.
Yeah.
And I feel it's extremely important, but when I do these little mini searches on Google, it always makes me feel like the imposter syndrome is kicking in. Like I'm not doing a real search. I'm just doing this little make-believe search on Google, but oh my gosh, look what I found. So It's just one of those little red flags. Go ahead, Danya.
Another thing that we were talking about is that when all the references reference review articles, and instead of actual original papers, and that can get quite concerning because when they reference multiple review articles that in all reality reference that one case series from 1964, and we run with that you're not supposed to do X for Y, and that's just not a thing anymore. I think that kind of shows that they either didn't dig behind the data or they're just propagating misinformation.
Yeah.
Another quick comment. So, as an author, you should redo your lit search before you turn the paper in. You did a lit search 3 years ago, and then stuff changed, and especially if you see this is the first time you've done something, make sure that's an accurate statement you can find anything then. So, redo your lit search before you send it in.
You just have to prepare yourself for that sinking feeling when you see that somebody published exactly what you're doing and did it just like 2 months ago. Yeah. But no, so references, don't gloss them over. There's still a lot that can be done there to help improve the quality of a paper, make sure a paper is quality, and then kind of like Elspeth said, just sort of increasing your own knowledge base of the current literature within our specialty. Okay, any other questions? Okay. So last, and I think Dr. Schoenfeld was saying that this is one of her sticking points.
We joked about this slide because none of us made the slide, so we're actually not totally sure if other people want to talk about it. So we'll go through it, but then bring up if you were the person that actually made the slide. Yeah. So I always, and I think we already said this, go back and read the abstract at the end, just because the number of times that you're like, wait a second, like I actually was liking the paper, and then I just realized that the abstract was different because you read that first. And if it went one way and then the paper kept going a different way, you won't actually realize that until you go back and read it again. So go back and read it again and look for, look for all the things that are like little red flags. Sometimes a trend towards significance is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. It depends on what your study was. If this was intended as a pilot, then maybe that's a reasonable thing to say. If this was a gigantic retrospective study where like you had huge numbers, then a trend towards significance is a terrible thing to say because if anything, you're overpowered to find results. This all goes back to study design and the analysis. So if they said that they were going to do intention to treat and they didn't do intention to treat, you're looking for things like that. If they're overly focused on their fifth of 12 secondary outcomes, what does that mean? They need to talk about it in a little bit more of sort of a toned down way. It's not that you can't talk about it. It was one of your outcomes, but maybe you need to tone it down or talk about how it's exploratory or that sort of thing. Making sure that you actually did the tests for what you claim that you did, accomplishing goals that you didn't actually state. And then this is something that, we should be a no-brainer, but if it's a registered clinical trial, we have to look at the actual registration for the clinical trial. And that's going to be true for your scoping reviews and your systematic reviews as well, because that protocol should be published somewhere that you can actually take a look at. And you know what we didn't talk about all of this is looking at the supplementary files. We don't have a slide on that. So the number of times where they will write a supplementary file in about something and then it somehow manages to not get into the reviewer's stuff. Like that's actually pretty important. Like maybe it's a supplementary file that you don't care about and you don't want more work to do. But if it's going to be published with it, you should probably take a look. And more often than not, it's something that you do need to look at. So for qualitative methods, the big thing there is like, I want your interview guide in your code book. Because if your interview guide asked a whole bunch of leading questions, then your results are crap, and we can't do anything with it. So knowing exactly what's in all that extra supplementary stuff is important, and you've got to make sure you're taking a look. What else? I know we have more comments. Mike first.
I was going to comment on our clinical trials, also for systematic reviews when they register them for law advance. Take a second and peel back the layers of the onion, because the one that's up there, they'll have like a list of all the versions. And I've had a decent number of cases, more than I expected, where they just before they published changed it. And you're like, oh yeah, this matches, but if you pull back, you're like, yeah, but 7 days ago, they did a very different outcome and a very different sample size, and they realized, oh, wait, we gotta change it. So it's not just a matter of just checking it, but I will actually pull back and be like, all right.
Check the version date.
The date stamp when they started the study is that they actually intended to do. And it's not a study killer, but they need to be honest about it. And the method to say, listen, we halted early for these reasons, we changed our outcome for these reasons. the major papers that have been published, I think Halton was one of them that did, like an intern, they had to stop adjusting his midstream. That's okay, but you have to talk through that.
I forgot.
Richelle.
So I say there's no trend towards significance. If you are for prejudice, either it was significant or not, period, end of story. And the same thing is when I say conclusion says, this may suggest this. So I had a mentor would say, anytime it may, change it with may not.
May or may not suggest
May
it.
or may not.
Yeah.
So either it shows us or it doesn't. We head what we want to see. So like, the data speak for themselves. And so we find what do we need to know next?
Other thoughts?
Just back to the abstract, I see some abstracts that report all of the odds ratios and likelihood ratios, but none of the data, the absolute difference between groups such that the reader can discern a treatment effect.
Yeah.
And you're 3 times more likely to do this than that. Well, that's nice. Is that 1% to 3%? Or is it 30% to 90%?
Right. Yeah, I think that's, so we didn't really talk about that, but making sure that their results are phrased in a way that a clinician can understand them, because that's a big deal. Like you're 3 times as likely, what are we talking about? If we're talking about 0.01 to 0.03, then that is a totally different clinical thing, but it may be relevant from a public health standpoint, and maybe we should publish it, but like how is the average clinician and reader gonna use that? You need to make sure that it is still readable and understandable to them, for sure.
And the 3 times more likely is what's going to be in the newspaper.
Right, yeah. All right, so I think our last thing is to, our last thing as small groups is to do these last parts together and look at our discussion critically. Yes?
I've got a question, especially for all the journal editors and like people who send stuff out for peer review. It's related to supplemental materials, which you talked about, and we'll probably have in a future iteration of this. Not often enough, but still growing trend is to include like the code that was used to process all of that. Is there currently like a process to do any sort of like program or quality assurance? And if not, like what do you all do for articles you receive to have someone look at that? Because I've looked at a decent number of supplemental things and there's a lot of shitty code out there. But I'm just curious.
Nothing. We do nothing on that.
Okay.
So at times we look at it. So at times, so obviously now, every journal now we're having data sharing statements.
Yeah.
But for years, we've had a data access where we sort of said, as a reviewer, as an editor, like, if you're willing to share the data, we sort of said, yes, I'll share it. We're like, oh, you made errors. Sometimes people are not willing to share it. We're like, well, we're not willing to sort of publish. And some people will get code and we'll take a look at it. So sometimes we found errors in people's code. And it's usually 1 or 2 of us in the messed up, so we'll take a look at something and say, hey, can I see this? But otherwise, it's sort of a part of data sharing statements. It's also what are you willing to share? I'm going to share part of my data, I'm going to share my data dictionary, I'm going to share my data code, and people can decide what to share. But most of it will get sort of published, just as sort of like you decide like how much is this useful to the reader versus this is accessible. The authors will provide it upon request. Or sort of just, online you can publish sort of anything, but it's sort of like what's usable for the reader, sort of looking at both sides of things, and for the next researcher and stuff like that. So some of us get sort of interested in that. Most people, like you said, most people don't read the method, so most people are not going to read the supplemental data code that we use.
I feel like sometimes the data available upon request means like thanks but no thanks. I mean, I think there's been like studies where they've looked at how many authors, I don't exactly know how to do it, but most authors that say their data is available upon request, in fact, it's not available. And sometimes they, sometimes there are true privacy concerns, HIPAA concerns, proprietary stuff that's like industry funded. Some, I don't know, some people put their code on GitHub, it's mostly our users, like there's not, that's why ChatGPT is terrible for like SaaS data, because people don't put it out there, but I don't know if it's because of like privacy or copyright concerns, but a lot more people do it are. But it's just, I don't know, I don't know, there's not a lot in, I don't know, as much in the
This whole thing, though, may be changing, because, now all the grant applications require this data sharing plan that involves, like, all your data, all your metadata, all your code putting on open science, on other frameworks. So if people are doing it anyway because NIH makes them do it, I think that the journals are going to be only one step behind. You were supposed to do this for NIH. We'd like to see it and have it accessible. So this may be a place of evolution.
Well, I remember what I was going to say. There's something that can actually, because nobody ever looks at it, can be a good place to like sneak in a little something, and then you can then reference it in a subsequent publication and be like, hey, that's in there, and just because reviewers never looked at it. Not that I said it tongue in cheek. I'm not suggesting that you're trying to like sneak in something that's fake, but yeah. But then the other thing I was going to say is it was hard to say nice things about this paper because there's so many smelly things about it. But be nice when you're reviewing a paper. Say some nice things. Like we've all written papers and gotten feedback where it's just like everybody's piling on, and then someone says like, oh, I really liked how you did X, or this was like a strength, or it was really elegant the way that you did such and such. Like it goes such a long way. Not that you're trying to put like a top hat on a turd or whatever, but it just when someone does something well, acknowledge it. Like it helps you feel better as a reviewer. It helps me be a little less snarky.
I'm just sending around 2 sheets to put in your name, email address, and if you want to have a mentor to help you with a peer review. One of the things that I was hoping to have available, but I found too many mistakes in it, was a list of just what are the common statistical tests that you would use or that you would look for, and if you saw something else, it would make you wince or wonder or say, we need a stats reviewer here for this. But if you don't, just those of you that are attending, I think I have everybody's email for the people that are facilitating. But let us know if you want a mentor for this, and we'll keep going with this discussion. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks. Kind of piggybacking on Rob's comment, one thing I've started doing with my reviews now is once I'm done, I don't submit it right away. I give it like 30 seconds or an hour. I come back and look at it and say, if I was the reader, like if I was the person who wrote this paper and put all this time into it and received this review, how would I receive this? It's actually forced me to be more thoughtful in terms of things that I didn't realize at the first glance came off as either condescending, not fixable, obtuse, and really hard to address. And I'll like couch it in terms of, okay, this is great. I picked apart the paper, but how do we fix it? How do we learn from it? And I found that to be really, really helpful. So I'd encourage you just, at whatever point before you submit it, just look at it as if you were about to receive this review. How would you receive it, and how could you actually act on it?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. So that we don't actually talk about this too much, which is like, what should your review like physically look like? And some journals give you check boxes, and then they say comments to the editor, and then they have comments to the author, right? And so the check boxes are to help you see what was important to the journal. Is this relevant? Is this important to the field? Is this going to have widespread interest? Is this not going to have widespread interest? But then you've got this free form comments to the editor where you're going to be honest and you don't necessarily have to like watch your language and that sort of thing. And then you're going to have comments to the author, which generally should start out with something nice about it, because why not? So for example, like they took on a challenging topic, right? So like that's, I think, one of the most common ones is like, this is a really challenging topic to study. I appreciate that the authors took on this challenging topic. And then you have to remember, like, what is your goal as a peer reviewer? Like, yes, all the things that we talked about in the beginning, you're pushing our field forward, you're helping your peers get things published, you're learning more as you do it, but like you're trying to help them get something published in the best way possible. And the more you do that, the harder it is for you. The easiest thing for you to do is say, I don't like this paper, reject, and give no feedback. And that's how it's helpful to the editor, but it's not at all helpful to the authors, right? So if you want to be helpful to the authors, then what follows is your thoughtful response, where you've started with your, okay, this is what you did right, and you're going to be brief in that because it's not going to be that helpful in terms of them making edits. Here are the major flaws, and here are the minor flaws. And sometimes the major flaws are really the whole paper, and so you don't have to do it sort of in order, abstract through discussion. And then sometimes it makes more sense to just talk about it in sort of the order of the paper and then sort of add on your minor things. I think that there's other ways to do it. That's just the way that I do it. And how much detail you get into depends on how much time you have. I don't know that it's worth your time to correct grammatical things, although I know that a lot of us, like, bad grammar makes us, like, it hurts us physically. But at the same time, you're not necessarily going to waste your time on that. All right.
Comment on that.
Yeah.
So I like really good reviews that make you feel better. Like they're really actually trying to help you. It starts off with, thank you for letting me or giving me the opportunity to review such and such a paper. And then they actually summarize a few sentences, just not the whole abstract, but just, just a little synopsis. And they do throw in those words of, what an interesting paper, what a thought-provoking, blah, blah, blah. And then they make it easy. They put a lot of effort into just making it easy for the author to address all their concerns. In addition to major and minor flaws, line item, this needs to be corrected, but just kind of makes it a little directive, if you will. Some people have a grid or whatever, and then makes it easier just for the author to review it. And you feel like they're actually trying to help you, so you're not as offended when you get that.
That's what we're doing. Trying to
15 pages, I know,
Right.
whatever.
And my practice is always to start my review for the authors with a little statement, thanks for this work, and this is a real big undertaking, or whatever it is. But then in my comments to the editor, I'll include a 3 or 4 sentence overview along with the strengths and the weaknesses to let the editor then incorporate that in their letter to the authors.
And you're also not supposed to say in the part to the author about whether you think the paper should be accepted or
Right.
rejected. And it's not, if you do, it's fine, the editor will take it out before they send it. We want to know whether you think it should be rejected or accepted, but
Right.
you don't want to say that because yours is not the final opinion.
And we're going to put it in nice language. So,
Or at least pre-specified language.
right. A little of both.
All right, so I think that we're going to talk in our groups about discussion and limitations, and then we're
Well,
going to...
we're almost out of time, actually.
No? Should we just...
I believe time flies when you're having fun,
So
right?
much fun.
Maybe we should, spend 10 minutes talking about in the groups and then get together and just kind of do a brief summary of the paper and how we as a peer reviewer, or should we just go right to that?
Quick specific question for the editors in the room. A lot of us are working with learners, so I have an ultrasound fellow. In the process of walking through a peer review, I think could be a tremendous learning opportunity for them. Provided that the text was de-identified, in what ways do you think it would be appropriate to, for example, walk my fellow through a peer review that I'm doing?
I think it's 100% appropriate. I think most of the papers are already de-identified. I think that most of us would be perfectly happy to have you do it as a teaching thing with somebody. That just helps us expand the pool of people who are able to do it. So I think as long as you're actually doing it and you're not just giving it to them to do and then submitting it, I think we'd be very happy to.
I think it's good for you to at least contact the editor and let them know that is what you do. Usually they'll say, great, but it's just a good thing just to make sure.
What it's worth historically, the old school 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you sent the paper to the editor, and the editor sent it to the Yamamoto lab, run by Professor Yamamoto. Yamamoto never looked at it. Yamamoto gave it to his fellow, or to the postdoc. So that's just the way it is. That's the way it's always been.
Yeah, Richelle?
Yeah, I mentor a lot of fellows that way, and people sort of come to me, or I sort of say, why don't you have your fellow do this? But usually, also want to give them sort of credit, but it's really the ethics of peer review, right? So when you decide to peer review, you sort of you've committed something to that author about being you're going to treat their work respectfully. You're not going to basically take, what a great idea, I'm going to trash that paper and go do the study and submit it somewhere, right? And all of those things is sort of what you share, and sort of, it is sort of the journal information. It's when someone signs a copyright over it, it's sort of whose work it is and those things. You just want to be mindful of that so people sort of know in terms of those things going on. But it's actually a great way for people to sort of learn in those things and to go over stuff and to give them credit. So I usually find hey, yes, and when they do that, I sort of tell them, yeah, we'll add them as a guest reviewer, and you'll just leave it in the comments. And so actually that person starts to get a track record as a reviewer. They submit the review.
Just a quick thing. So for our education issue for WestGem, Jeff Love and Doug Ander, who are the guest editors for 7 years, they have a program where senior reviewers take their fellows along with them and teach them in the process how to do the education reviews.
I personally think that we should be asking our learners to do peer reviews, or to at least allow us to mentor them through a peer review. And I don't know if it's really necessary to contact the editor. As long as we're doing the review, we're not just going to turn in the one that they submitted. We're going to actually mentor them through a review that's going to be the same quality as the one that we would submit.
Yeah, I think as long as you're taking responsibility for it, but sometimes, depending on the journal, they like to see the one
Right.
the fellow did too. So in other words, you would submit both. And if you do that, then I think it's good to just communicate with the editor.
Right, it's not the guy that Jeff was mentioning. We don't want him. So do people have any questions about this paper, about peer review, in general, about any specifics?
Maybe for those who are interested in getting involved, do you have recommendations on how to do so?
Well, so the sheet I
Yes,
have
that's there.
put your name and email
Yeah.
address, and if you want to do some peer reviews with mentoring, I know some of us have indicated in the past that we'd be willing to do that, and hopefully we get more and more people involved in that. The Evidence-Based Health and Implementation Interest Group started an initiative to try and get peer review listed as a, what was the term that they were supposed to use, Carly? A specified number of peer reviews as a requirement for scholarly, or as a possible requirement for scholarly work during residency. Right now, it's only listed as a categorical, yes or no. And what we're trying to do is get it listed as number of peer reviews that would count towards the scholarly input, output of a resident.
Of the faculty, for WebEx, for the faculty WebEx, not for.
And the SAEM board signed off on that and sent a letter to ECFMG, which basically replied by, we like this, it's a good idea, and no good deed goes unpunished. We've been invited to provide an article for the ACGME bulletin, whatever it's called, on this topic, and why it's important. The issue that they thought would be a barrier and that we would have to address is that program directors, and there may be a few here, program directors don't want any additional requirements for reporting, which is legitimate. I mean, I can see it, but again, this is something that does move the profession forward, and it's something that is relatively easy for us to get residents involved in and to get them doing these and becoming then peer reviewers when they're out of practice, and increasing our pool of peer reviewers so that we don't have to wait so long to get people.
Given that most residents don't go into academics, it's an optional opportunity. We offered it to our residents. Very few of them wanted to do it, but it's just nice that it was an option.
Right. And if they know that it would be counted as part of their scholarly work, that might make it a little more attractive for them. And again, if they're going to be out in community practice, I mean, they're still reading the journals. And I think many of them would like to keep just to keep a little bit of a hand in academics by being a peer reviewer, and at least legitimizing it as something that we hold is valuable.
I don't know, Mark, what's your experience when I've tried to do campaigns to get junior reviewers that can be mentored? It doesn't go very well.
It's tough. I mean, you may have gotten an email. We picked out 150 fellowships from the SAM website, research-oriented emergency medicine fellowships, and sent communication to each of the fellowship directors to ask which of their fellows they wanted to check under the bus and have peer reviews. We got a few. We got 5 or 8 back or something like that. So not a big response.
The exact number I was going to say is like about 5 will respond, and one of them will. I mean, you really just don't get.
I don't know if we actually got any reviews yet.
Yeah, it's a little bit embarrassing, you know. You sort of want to help be helpful, but then you get those responses.
What's neat with fellows are a perfect audience to try to share most of it to start.
I think if we spin it, what's in it for them, just the benefits. I don't think that many of them know
there's a lot of chairs out there telling them not to do it. And I can't count any chair.
Not to do peer reviews?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That is a waste of time. It's a waste of your time. I've heard, I can name the names of the chairs.
Oh, I want that.
There are good people too, but there's enough of the bad ones out there.
And I also think that, I think we've been, these people are very interested in peer review. We've heard somebody say it takes 6 hours to do a review. Yeah, it can. As a journal editor, if you spend 2 hours on my review, I'm going to be overjoyed.
Me too.
We're not getting, we don't get.
It's a skill that you learn over time. The more you practice, the more you do, the better you become, the easier it comes, the quicker it becomes, right? So I do a lot of reviews. It's not taking me that long, but that's sort of, obviously, I come from a different perspective. You should, like everything in academics, anything you do, like everything takes time. So make sure you're doing something you get something out of, right? But also sort of like you submit your article, it's sort of like, it's also good to actually feel like I should review your journal because someone reads my paper. And so it's sort of part of the communal sort of aspect of those things. And you can, whether chairs, whether each department is sort of different, but there are ways, your organ ID, like Elspeth will tag that, so we'll actually track your reviews, and ways to sort of do that. So if you're at some place where the chair values that, or there's sort of, if they're used to counting the things that they do, there are ways to actually get those things in the credit.
What also counts, actually, I'm sorry, just real briefly, what also counts are case reports, visual diagnosis. You just want to have that experience in reviewing, and that counts as being a reviewer. And they don't take 6 hours at all. And you can also indicate what area of interest. So I'm an ultrasound person, so you send me ultrasound articles, and that would be a great place to start.
I think one of the other methods that wasn't totally highlighted is that the reviewers are also ones who are often asked to do the editorials. So it's a hidden method that if you do a really good review, well, I'm very likely to tap you to say, would you like to write an editorial that's accepted? Because you've demonstrated you have content expertise, you can write well, and they've had critical analysis. So often those are the people who are tapped up to.
I would also say, I think it's a reasonable question for, novice or even veteran peer reviewers to say, like, what's in it for me? I mean, the people, in this room, right, recognize that there's some, there's academic benefit to it, right? It goes towards your promotion. And I think Elspeth, who left the room, said, it's a chance to, learn something, sort of, to some extent, drive the direction of your, research area of expertise. But, that's, to a resident, to a new attending, it's I don't know, it can be a harder sell. Like, why should I do this unpaid thing? And, you read about how much, was it just Elsevier who had everybody walk out because they were making so much money? And that's not like a comment towards anyone or any journal or anything in particular, but these are things that I don't know, I think if we're going to continue to get people encouraged in the peer review, some of these things are problems that we should talk about and not be like, oh, hush, hush, no, it's really good, you'll learn something. I mean, I think I do think it's true, but it's also, I have some junior faculty I mentor, why should I do this? It just seems like I'm doing free work for no real benefit. I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what other people in the room think about that, but I don't know.
Most of the things that I do.
Right, no, I wait.
So you choose those things. And I think it's not for everyone, but you definitely get that. I'm a better writer, I'm a better researcher, I'm a better editor because of the peer review. But that's not necessarily for everyone, right?
Right, no, I mean, I agree. That's why I said people in this room, we're here, you're here, you've been doing it for 25 years. But, it's just, I don't know, how do you tell people that are, newer to it who, I don't know, maybe there's not an easy answer.
I think that the biggest sell is you will be a better writer. If you want to publish yourself, read other people's stuff.
And if you're interested in research, a better researcher. So we're kind of near the end. I have, the universe gave me this piece of paper, Notes and Records. It's of the Royal Society. It's apparently a journal in England somewhere. And I thought it was particularly poignant, and I wanted to just, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a little bit of it to you. When I think about peer review as editor-in-chief of Notes and Records, I remember to ask myself, why do scholars write? Is it curiosity, ambition, hope, courage, or all those qualities blended into the creative impulse to say, I have some new knowledge, so what do you think? She goes on to talk a little bit about the history of scholarship and things, getting things right and getting things wrong. And then says, as an editor, this process of refinement and care and scholarly exchange in the peer review process is a wonderful thing to observe and to facilitate. And the most wonderful result of successful peer review is to see a paper published, whether that's a young scholar making their debut in the scholarly community or a more experienced colleague who tries something new and succeeded. If done correctly, both the peer reviewer and the author reevaluate their expertise and communicate in a kind and collegial fashion, because when it comes down to it, peer review in its ideal form is both an act of altruism and an act of investment in the continuation of the scholarly enterprise by our colleagues. That's why it's so important to engage in thoughtful peer review as a scholar, and that's why it is important to do it well, acting not as a gatekeeper, but as a fellow contributor in the creation of knowledge, collective wisdom. And I heartily thank all the peer reviewers from Notes and Records for their own collective wisdom and their excellent service to the journal. And it's signed Anna Marie Roos, School of History and Heritage, College of Arts, University of Lincoln. Anyway, I thought that just kind of spoke to me as, what's this all about? What are we really doing? Anyway, any last minute questions? I want to thank our facilitators, all of our faculty guys who did a great job. And hopefully we'll do this again in the future sometime. There will be evaluations somewhere. We don't know exactly where they'll be, but I know SAEM wants to hear from you, so please fill those out.
So
and
finish this and recommend that they would be accepted, is that what
I think so, right? Right. If anyone wants to talk about ROC curves, here afterwards without a microphone. And there's something else, but it's okay.
Dan really wants to talk about ours. I'll get you a whiteboard. Really
Oh, one more thing. Last thing. Hey, guys. Sorry, everybody put in a plug for their session. We have a session on how to do retrospective medical record reviews. That's Thursday morning at 8 a.m.
No, you would water up. What's that? You're bold.